questions. Thank you for recording me. That there's likely going to be more need for feedback back and forth with the IRST than perhaps there has been on some of the other packages. We've had some back and forth on some of the others, but these questions in particular, I think will probably elicit a little bit more back and forth with the IRST in terms of them, clarifying questions back to us and back to them. And I don't think we should necessarily shy away from that, or I think we'll just need to work through that and recognize that's probably going to be necessary. I also think there is some potential value here in giving them more of a sort of game plan long term, right? And that is, if we could get to a point where we say this question and this question are like our priority questions right now. Let us know how much you think or what this would look like for research. But then these are some other questions we think, and these are the priority list. I mean, I definitely open for discussion there with you guys, but I think there's potential value there in sort of outlining where we might go in the future, even if it is, several years down the road to get to an eventual other question that we outline. And that I think has value for IRST and AMC. I think it also has value potentially for the services to show for where we different questions that we'd like to have answered in this program.
So this question, Vivian, is such an open-ended question. I think what Steph has just said about the length of time and the number of evolving questions that may come makes the conversation with the IRST different than the other questions. But the question I have was, does the board of forestry know that? How do we phrase to them? Because for me, when I think about what I heard and what I don't know is so vast here. This is one of those ones where I'm expected to have a lot of input about a lot of little things where I have a little piece of knowledge, but I know where the experts are. Here is one where I'm not even sure where the experts are. And so I don't know, my question is the Board of Forestry ready for a question that may take us 3, 5, 7 years? Because we're going to ask some questions along the way to develop a question that might change the forest practice. I'm not sure because that's what I'm looking for, is things that change the forest practice to better save and better facilitate management. I'm looking for those types of questions. And this is a question that is basically building knowledge. So I just wonder, are they prepared for, have they thought about this question and how long this one may take? Because it may run this question for years before we actually ask the question that causes a change.
I think that's a great point, and sort of to what you were saying before, Seth, we should give some thought as a committee and with the IRST about how we are communicating to the board, and maybe there's opportunity for presentations to sort of build up their knowledge and set expectations around this is going to look different than the Eastern Oregon steep slopes question. Other thoughts on that? I also maybe wonder if maybe this is a good one, if we're able to submit a question package to IRST, would this be the type of one where a conversation and joint meeting about that question package could actually be pretty productive instead of sort of written questions back and forth? I think we might have some good things come out of that, and I'm curious. I'm seeing heads nodding.
Yeah.
Wendy?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that approach makes sense to me, and I think the important thing is just like somehow if the introduction or the contact with Board of Forestry just set it up correctly and saying this is a very broad question, which is somewhat unusual, so we'll not be proceeding very immediately to some sort of research study, but we'll be initially gathering information, and we expect we may be adapting some of the sub-questions over time based on what we initially learned.
Yeah.
So if they're expecting that, and we, to tee it up like that with IRST and then have some conversation back and forth, that sounds appropriate to me.
Dave, Julie, Jason, thoughts online? I can't see all of you, so.
So let me just chime in. Although we didn't discuss with the board directly the amphibians questions, there was a part of the conversation that the board is aware that anything that comes out of the AMPC might take years. I mean, they're familiar that the research cycle in and of itself often takes 2 to 4 or 5 years before you get results, and you might need to have a follow-up study. So they are familiar with that. And then the second question about informing the board, I think it's an intricate balance of not over involving them in the minutia and the weeds too much, while at the same time keeping them informed of what's happening. So that's just something to make sure to do that nuanced conversation at the right
Yeah.
time, at the right level.
That's well said, Terry. I think that's spot on.
Yeah, just real quick, Terry, and then go to you, Dave. I totally agree with that. And I think, you know, if things stay on track, July will be presenting a research agenda to the board, and that will be another opportunity to sort of frame up expectations for them. So we will be, besides just our annual update, we'll have more touch points with the board moving forward.
And I keep in mind, the last major rule change for the Board of Forestry in on riparian issues prior to the PFA was a several year-long process that started with Ripstream, a study looking at temperature. So it's not as if the Board of Forestry is not used to that sort of a policy. And I think compared to that, we may show that we're more efficient. Right.
Data collection, not planning, not study design, but actual collection of data started in 2002, and the rule change that came from that took effect 2017.
Yeah, so
So it was a pretty long process to get there, and there was 3-4 years of study design and site selection and so on before that, so.
it's not as if the Board of Forestry has a track record of super. So I'm not terribly concerned, but yeah.
Dave, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce and agree with what you said, Stacy. I've mentioned it several times before. There are times when it seems to me a meeting of whatever format makes sense is best between AMC and IRST to create the best set of questions and to flush them out. Because none of us here are experts in this, and there's probably a bunch of that they're not either. And so I think our best approach in this case is to work together to the extent that we can.
Appreciate that, Dave. I'm curious, maybe just like thumbs up, down, middle. Do people like the idea of a joint meeting with IRST to discuss a hypothetical question package we have not yet approved, but when we do, does that make sense as? I phrase that well, meeting with IRST.
My only concern there, my only hesitation is it starts to bleed the policy conversation with the science conversation. And as much as scientists try to stay in their lane of science, they have opinions that are more on the side of policy opinions than scientific, you know, and we all do, everybody does. And so it's naive to assume that they wouldn't. And so we may think about how we structure that, what kind of questions we have there to lessen the, you know, sort of that, and not put them in the awkward position where we're asking them to weigh in on, you know, it's a dance, right? And I just think we should, so I'm not opposed to it. It's just going in with that caution.
Wendy and then Amanda.
I just think it could be useful to have a meeting with the IRST, and maybe that the topic of amphibians and these questions could be one of the things we discussed, because there've been some questions from them about how did you like the way we approached this steep slopes project? And so I think it could be useful as a little real time back and forth on that, because that kind of thing can take forever to write down. And sometimes if you're just like, it'd be more helpful if you did this, oh, we can change that, but we can do it this way. Have that kind of conversation maybe as a second item on that agenda. So it won't be as long a meeting. It might not bleed between the two areas as much.
Amanda?
Yeah, I just wanted to put a finer point maybe on the comments that Seth was making around really identifying the what we're trying to achieve and what we want to research and kind of what those policy sideboards are. before we go to that, before we go and meet with the IRFs, I think it's good to meet with them, but I do think that instead of doing the back and forth, and we wanna change, the wording on this question to X, and then we, review that, and it's more of that process that I do think we need to make sure that we have the general concepts right and something firm that we feel comfortable going to them with, knowing that instead of, basically the meeting is to reduce the timeline around the back and forth rather than to collaborate on questions to be used. So just to be clear, that's what I would hope the intent would be.
Yes. That's what I was thinking as well. It would be a question that we voted on, the question package is sent to them as per normal process, and then we would have an opportunity to get together and discuss that. Similar to the questions that they've asked us about the Eastern Oregon steep slopes, just create a little more back and forth. I wanna put a slight pin in the process stuff, because I think this is really helpful, but I'm hopeful that we can get pretty close to something we might be able to vote on either today or at our next meeting. Excuse me. So, excuse me. I think if we can go back to the slideshow.
Spicy food.
I tried to pull out, because I guess I was having a tough time really reading all the track changes and sort of what they meant, so I tried to pull that out into different slides.
Oh, I see. I think you have
Yeah,
to share your
so-
screen too.
Great. Folks online see that?
Yes.
So I tried to pull out, and this may not be fully exact, but from our first conversation where we had a draft question that then we discussed and the work group discussed, that's that original sort of initial question we as a group had come up with. Then question 1 in red below, that's the track changes version coming out of the work group. But to me, it was just sort of helpful to pull that out in one place, because I think the questions that come up for me are, I guess to start, the track changes version developed by the work group. Sort of in parentheses, you guys asked the question, should this just be the torrent salamander species, or should this question be all of the covered species? And I guess I wasn't clear if you all had sort of come to a thought coming out of that work group.
We figured we'd kick it to this one for discussion. I think that's what we were intending with that.
Great, so I think if the intent of this question is really establishing a baseline, and we've gone back and forth on how we might define that, distribution, genetic, demographics, all those things. I guess maybe to start, does it make sense, do we want to phrase a baseline question, this question 1, for all the covered amphibian species, or does it make sense at this point to hone in on the ones that we understand to potentially be most sensitive, or where there might be the most to learn from?
To put a finer point on that question, I guess, going back to the report, with there being kind of that earmarked 1.5 million for the
Yeah.
2 torrents. My perspective is probably that we focus on that, knowing kind of, again, that could be like 50 years worth of research. That if we focus on those that have been identified as the top 2 for us to look at, especially given, some of the findings that research is currently kind of displaying on their life histories and where they're typically located, being that upper reach of the water, kind of those non-fish perennial streams and whatnot. It probably makes sense to focus on those for all those reasons, but I'd love to hear what others.
So, see if they yell at the ceiling while I talk. So, a lot of the question two, has a lot of, 2-point whatever questions, which are all focused on the Columbia and Southern torrent salamanders. If I'm recalling, those are the guys that like the non-fish streams, the higher, more cascadey things. And so they're gonna be more in question than guys that'll hang out in those small fish bearing reaches that have 100-foot no harvest. So on the question two stuff, I really do think we need to really focus on those torrent salamanders. This one being broader, I'm actually interested in having this since it looks like it's more literature based. Get the two torrents, but also kind of what do we know, what's the state of knowledge, the baseline of knowledge for all the covered amphibian species plus the two torrents. Because we're going to focus on the torrent so much, I think appropriately on the more like on the ground focused part, multi-part question two. I'd like to see us on this, kind of establish a baseline so that we have a standard for comparison later if we want to come back and check on that, the big guys and all that, and see how not just type in rules like for the torrents, but also we want to later on have a check-in on how those type F rules are working for bigger amphibians that hang out in the fish bearing habitat. So I'd like to do this one broader, just my opinion. And then I think appropriately have question two and all its sub questions. However, we hone that down, really focus on the torrents.
One
That's
for
my
each so far. Julie,
Julie.
Julie online, do you wanna?
Yeah, so if we do that, I think that it could be possible to do a literature review for all, but maybe then question one should be split into two questions. One that's specific to a literature review that covers all the amphibian species, and two that's baseline information on the two torrent salamander species, just to be clear.
Thoughts on Julie's proposal? Amanda?
Yeah, I kind of had a similar thought to Julie, kind of for the work group, maybe, what the intent was by including a robust literature review. That seems like including that plus something else. So does the literature review associated with the research proposal, like the research packet, include what we're looking at here? Would it not include kind of what we're trying to get at? Kind of that's the first question, and if it doesn't include what we think we need, then maybe it does make sense to split it out to have a all species, covered species, amphibian species lit review, and then actual field work trying to get that baseline data on the two torrents. And then maybe even some further breaking out of the specifics within the question, which is maybe a run-on sentence, but I think we can get there.
Jason, I'm gonna go to you because you were also on the work group and maybe you can answer that.
Perfect. Yeah. And Seth and Casey, feel free to weigh in. We had a lot of conversation about all or being very narrow in our focus. And we kept coming back to being narrow in our focus because of our previous conversations around, what is specifically called out for torrent salamanders, as well as trying not to distract the focus from, once we develop a baseline, then we can use that baseline for subsequent questions and subsequent analysis into the future. But if we keep it very specific and focused now, it allows us to kind of get things moving forward a little bit quicker. And that was kind of some of our general conversation is, if we're really looking at this large scale literature review for all species that are covered, it's going to take some time. It's going to take some focus away from those species that we have some called out focus within our guidance to take a look at. And then what we meant by robust literature review is really it's what do we know? And that's really what we're trying to get at. What do we know currently? And how do we keep that focus to this the torrent species? So Casey, Seth, anything to add to that?
Sure, yeah, I'll add in that what I remember the discussion of, and certainly what my thoughts were, was that we wanted to make sure that There's some literature out there for some of these species, right? So we wanted to make sure that they knew the portion of this question certainly can be partially answered with literature review. And you can start to draw that crayon, you know, of where you're gonna find them in the state. Maybe that broad sort of geographic range could be done with a literature review. But then there's definitely questions, you know, specific to where do you find them within these areas and what, you know, that are probably more, that are probably going to require on the ground research. And so that I think is that's what I meant when we put that in there. And I think there's value. The challenge is that there's value in both, right? To Josh's point, there's value in establishing a baseline for all of the species, like early on, and making sure that that baseline is well established, so that we can build off of that with some of the future questions are questions that will rely or need to have that sort of baseline to be able to answer them. And yet, we're directed more towards the torrents, for obvious reasons. And so maybe you can hit the ground. So I did talk to a colleague of mine who does work in the amphibian space, and I asked them specifically that question, and their response to me was that it's actually not that difficult if you're already, the expense of going out in the field is with hiring up the crews and getting them outlined, and here's your jobs, and you know, you're gonna go out here and you're gonna go out there. Once they're out there, cataloging what they find in terms of different species is not all that much. So if you add, you know, this species or that species on while they're doing that field site, now it probably will also require going to different field sites because you're gonna find them in different areas. So I'm not saying there's no expense, but the response back to me was it's less of an expense to look at than you might think, because you're gonna find them in similar places.
If you're looking at small type end streams, it's pretty simple to just go a little farther.
Yeah.
Downstream at the same study site to get the
The
smaller
other-
streams.
yeah.
And other streams where you're gonna have the bigger amphibians.
Once you've done your monitoring plan.
So I guess I mean, I kind of like the idea of maybe trying to do both, like you're talking about, like I mean, this is me personally, for the purpose of the discussion, I like the idea of doing all the species as question 1, maybe 1.2 or whatever, when we get more into, you know, demographics and whatever, you know, maybe that's where you focus in on the torrents and you're doing a little bit more, you know, work there with them. I don't know, but that intrigues me.
Julie, got your hand up?
Yeah, I just needed someone to confirm or correct my memory. So my recollection was that the only other amphibian species other than the 2 torrent salamanders was Pacific giants. Is that right? That there's just one other species that we're talking about, or are there multiple?
There's more,
Okay.
and I thought there was another salamander, giant salamander, coastal tail frog.
Salamander.
Yeah.
I thought there was. I can't recall.
I feel like you terrible. I can't remember, but the other salamander.
There's the tail frog for sure, so there's more than the giant.
Is the list in 7.2, this is to Terry, is that 7.2 goals, is that our list? Scrolling down to page 6. Coastal and cove giant salamander, coastal tail frog, Columbia and torrent.
Yes, the
Okay.
2 giants.
There's 2 giants.
2 giants, that's it.
Yeah, 2
Yeah,
giants.
coves and coastal.
Tail frog.
He answered our question, Terry. Thank you. Way to coordinate us.
We went ahead and read the supply material.
So I think I'm hearing some alignment around a question 1 that is focused on all of the species as a baseline question, and a 1.2 that is more specific to the torrent salamanders. That is a more robust baseline question. Is that fair to say? Does anyone have concerns with sort of trying to do both, I guess?
Be broad and specific.
Yeah. Jason?
No, I just wanted to say, Seth, thank you for bringing that additional information in terms of your conversations, because I think as you think about it, it's economy of scale. Yeah, if we're out there, what can we collect? My only question is with those other species, is the question around, limiting it to 1, 2, 3? Is it going fully broad? And then that's where we start to, I think where our conversation was is, do we start to now look at completely different habitat types, completely different species, and do we start kind of going off the track at that point? So I would just want to clarify that, because I support the fact that if boots are going to be on the ground, let's get the data we need to help us be successful. But what does that look like, I guess, would be my question.
My question, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but my question along kind of similar lines to Jason's is, if question 2 and like the sub questions under 2 are focused on the 2 torrents, then is it reasonable, like, I guess, why would we need that other baseline information now instead of incorporating that into like future monitoring when we get to the point of including those other species? In questions maybe similar to what we have for the 2 torrents. Because like if we collect baseline now, is that what we want to compare it to, or are we wanting to like compare kind of current conditions at the time when we ask those other questions? Just trying to think of like timing on what makes the most sense and at what point is maybe baseline information no longer really the baseline because we're comparing it to 10 years ago versus to like the conditions today. Again, I don't know when we're going to get to those other species, but if we're focused on the 2 torrents, then to me, it makes sense to focus that additional information, in that way.
Yeah.
Julie and then Will.
Yeah, I'd feel okay about, mentioning that if it's efficient to gather data on a species while you're there, great, but we want to emphasize that our focus is on those 2 species.
So because of the lack of data in my mind, I mean, it could be when they do their literature research, there is actually more data than I might think there is. But because of that, having any data, even if it's benchline data we take today, and it has some limitations based upon where we were, we may not have been far enough down the interface between N-type streams and F-type streams, and so we may have missed something. But having some baseline data would never hurt, that you can go back and look to. It is the change in what's happening to these critters that we're worried about. So I would be all for trying to come up with a way to do all of the listed salamander and frog, and then but focus on the torrents as we move forward with additional things besides first run field work and literature research reviews.
You can make Jim for a second. I agree with Josh, and I think I'm hearing some consensus on this where I think it does make sense to have a baseline, this baseline question 1 be focused on all species, particularly with Seth, your conversation with an expert who does this, the additive information for not that much additional cost. And then I'm curious, coach your hat back on. If question 2, I think to your point, Amanda, that is, as it stands now, all those questions are focused on the torrent salamanders. Does that get us where we need to be? If question 1 is a broader baseline on all species and the question 2 and the sub questions are focused on the torrents, or is anyone concerned that question 1, and we can maybe include framing language that says like, we really care about the torrents, but also we want to look at everything. Do we need to add a sub question as we had previously discussed?
Well, one thought I have, one idea I would have, we could put this forward, right? If we had enough consensus around the table to put a question one forward in the fashion you're talking about, Stacy, where it is all of the species. And sort of the baseline. But then with the understanding that we'd want to have a dialogue, and that would be part of the dialogue that we would have with the IRST. Basically, what is this costing us to get these additional species? If it's too much, then maybe we take that back and have another subsequent conversation about toning it down just for Florence. For question one. I mean, that could be part of our back and forth. That's certainly something that doesn't ask them to stray out of their lane. You know, they can help inform us in terms of what that would look like, and they can answer that question. You know, it was a one-off question I had with a researcher, whereas this would be more than one researcher weighing in and saying, what would the relative cost benefit be for gathering information up around all of these species, and then we would have a better idea. We could always take that back and have a 1 hour focused meeting or something, or half hour, where we all get together and say, okay, let's get rid of the other species, let's just go torrent, because this is gonna cost us way too much money or whatever. You know, I mean, that's an iterative sort of way to approach this, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah, Seth actually said about half of what I was gonna say. The other piece is, you know, I've had many cases in my career where I'm looking at something and I think, gosh, I wish someone would have collected data on this, you know, 15 years ago, so that I would have something, you know, like another time step for comparison. And you can't, no one's figured out a way to travel back in time to collect data. And so that, you know, I think kind of trying to get everything now, we may not have questions about anyone but the torrents now. I think that's appropriately the focus of question two. But we could come to a point in the future where, like, okay, we need to look at the efficacy of the rules for the two giants and the coastal frog, and we don't have the info. But something that would be included in the literature review and then ask IRST about is, hey, what's going on out there that might provide us with this baseline? So Dr. Garcia, I believe, and her group was collecting this data. So is that going to get us? Is that the baseline data already? That could be part of question one, I guess. Is that baseline data already being collected by state or federal agencies or by academic scientists? And all we need is a summary of what's going on with the two giants and the coastal tailed frog, and then we can focus the rest of our efforts, like through question two and all its parts, on the two torrents. Yeah.
I wonder if for question one, if we keep it broad to all species and include a list of the specific species and ask IRST, to your point, Seth, I think, to sort of say like, well, if you just do this, this is what it would roughly be. You can combine, you know, coastal tailed frogs in this species because of whatever reason, maybe just specifically asking them, you know, what it would cost per species.
It's like a 10% add-on to
Right.
go a little lower down the stream network. It's already hired all the bachelor students, you know, bottom waiters.
And I'm five longer waiters though.
Yeah.
Well, I do have a proposal, but first I would like to say for the record that Doc Brown and Marty McFly did figure out a way to go back. It's a flux capacitor. If we just get people focused on that, we can solve a lot of problems.
That's not the research, but high scores, there's so many ways to move back in the past. But we just haven't figured it out for in the end.
But Terry, I put in the chat some proposed restructuring of question one. I think it keeps it intact for what we're what we're asking, but I think it does it in a more concise and understandable way. So I don't know if you wouldn't mind popping that up and people could get a chance to look at it. So
Or if you could just go to the next slide, I put text in purple. That was my rough attempt to throw that together before the conversation. So maybe we can just use that slide and put your
Okay.
text on there.
If you're able to do that, Sarah. And while she's doing that, something to consider about that question of, hey, IRST, what would the extra cost be? And Sean, you probably have a better feel for this, Sean Gordon, than I do, but the concern I have is they might not have a succinct answer. Maybe they will. It'd be great if they did, but so maybe consider that as you forward a question about, hey, how much extra would this cost?
Are you able to see it in the chat? For the Zoom?
Yeah, I can see it in the chat of the Zoom.
You go up to the top and click on chat.
Next to share.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Oh.
Click on chat. Now you can just grab it right there. That's it, 1.1. And just plop that in there and people can get a chance to look at it. Maybe we could could use Stacy's and play off that and see what people think.
Wendy, do you wanna?
I was just gonna say, a little bit of this comes back in with Seth's version, but I liked keeping the distribution within watersheds and between watersheds throughout the state and seasonal changes and genetic demographics. I liked including that detail. I don't like,
I just purely threw that together as that's a placeholder for
Yeah.
conversation
Yeah.
and group editing, so that was not necessarily indicative of anything, just trying to move us along, so let's see what you put up there, so.
Is there any way to make it bold so it's a little bit easier to see? Maybe it's just my eyes.
yeah, for me, I like the language in there that talks, that implies that we're doing between watersheds, because on our field trip, that was emphasized as important to include.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I just was trying to get us maybe to a consensus on the species, and then we'll go to actually what we're asking about those species first.
Right, I agree, and I think that's that's where I broke out question 1.2, because we had two questions in question one. One was, where do we find them? And the other one was more about demographics and genetics.
So looking at Seth's proposal in black, the 1.1, and for the purpose of this section of our conversation, just thinking about, is this a baseline question for all covered species, or do we want to break that out? I think I'm hearing consensus around including all of the covered amphibian species for a baseline question. Is that?
What's 1.1 would be what we would do for question one for the all species baseline.
Yes, and if you wanna put like a line through the purple stuff, or we can just delete it. So that's adding confusion.
I still would like, just to go back to our original question, the working group question, to just take out the paren or focus only on two current salamander species. I kind of like the way the working group came up with it. I mean, I don't mind having the initial description of what we're looking for and the fact that the purpose is establishing a baseline, because I think giving them a cue that we're looking for baseline is useful. And again, I want to include the inner watershed concept.
So just to make sure I'm tracking, Wendy, your proposal is, the question would be, what is the distribution both within watersheds and between watersheds throughout the state?
Yeah, it would
Starting
just be
there.
question one, as it was in the document set out that the working group did. But just when the question is asked or focus only on two torrent salamander species, just take out that question, which would be just like the original version, but taking out the question that was posed to us.
The primary purpose of me rewriting it was to clarify within watersheds, between watersheds throughout the state. Because I think that is confusing for it. It could be, I suspect we're gonna get a lot of questions on that from the researchers. What do you mean? So that was my attempt to try to clarify it before getting those questions.
And which one was which color is your proposal? Like
The black.
Okay, sorry.
So
Do
rather.
you mean to cover between watersheds and what you said?
when you say between
Well,
watersheds,
being
what do you
able to
mean?
go, like, well, it's true, they meet, right? But,
Right.
in
See,
terms
that's
of-
what I'm saying,
Yeah.
it's not worded
I see
super
what you're
clearly.
saying, okay, but, I thought it was a shorthand way of saying ability to travel between watersheds.
See, I think that's a different question, and I think it's helpful, and we can ask that question, that's where
Yeah.
I'm saying that question 1.2 should be about that sort of thing. Question 1.1 is more, where do we find them? Question 1.2 would be more about when we do find them, what is their, that's where we get into demographics and genetics, and we can ask all sorts of questions, movement and things like that.
Mhm.
That was my thought about how we wrote it in the first instance.
Josh?
I do think Seth's 1.1 will cover that because,
Uh-huh.
and we could add something to the example factors, but what determines that distribution? I mean, part of that distribution is, are they distributing, are they going back and forth?
If you're good with it, I'm good with it.
So I
It'd be
think
more of a
I think
science.
it covers it,
Yeah,
and then when we get, a proposal back from IRST, if it's not, it's not getting to that concept of can they move cross ridge lines essentially between hydrographic units, then we can say, yeah, we need to know about that part of their genetic distribution. How do they, moving around, how's gene flow happening? So I think it covers it. I'm fine with that one. Honestly, I don't have a real preference on what was in the package, mine with the parenthetical chopped out, or Seth's simplification. I'm personally fine with it.
So Amanda, Casey, and I'm gonna check on mine.
Okay, I don't know if this is a question for Terry or maybe Sean, but I'm just trying to remember what the response has been from Erst when we have identified specific factors to measure. So like here, we're identifying that we want them to include the different spatial scales, and I guess in the suggestion one, Stacy, that you had the seasonal distribution and all these different features, like, is it enough for us on the policy side just to ask about distribution? Like, do we need to actually identify from a scientific perspective what all the factors are that need to be measured? Or do we feel like we need to identify those because there is a policy perspective that we need that specific information to make a policy decision in the future? It's just like a question out there, and I don't know, Terry or Sean, if you guys can respond in remembering how Erst has responded to us identifying those specific factors in our proposals in the past.
Yeah, it's okay if I jump in. I think it's helpful to give examples, but maybe make it clear that you aren't restricting it to those examples.
Yeah.
Right. So, the direction would be first, look for factors that seem to be important from the science. But if there is a policy interest in specific factors, then, I think we should just be clear that that's the reason, and, are these kind of fixed things you want investigated, or are they just examples of the types of things you want investigated?
Thank you.
That's really helpful, Sean, thank you. And I think I was hearing a side proposal to maybe get to that point, Josh.
Oh, yeah, so Seth had included the et cetera, which sort of implies that these are, examples. So, I mean, I think we can cover that concern by in front of stream grading, putting EG, it's not like.
That's how
Yeah, to just, because I kind of read the, for example, into there, but
Yeah.
I think we can do that.
And it does include and what factors determine.
Yeah, because those are important from a policy perspective, right? Because addressing those things one way or the other, if change needs to be made, it means changing the regulation, right? So that's sort of implied, stream size, fish presence and absence, all that ties directly into the regulation. So there's a policy imperative for those particular ones, but there may be things that are important, also important biologically that may or may not have policy implications that if IRST or their contractor says we need to add those, or those need to be addressed or examined, then we can do that. So I think we just want to make clear those are examples. Just so happens from our perspective, they might be policy relevant examples.
Casey, and then back to Amanda.
Oh, yeah, I have, thanks, folks, since this is an incomplete, 1.1 implies a 1 point other.
Two.
Can we see that?
Yeah.
Because I'm just kind of like, I don't want to make any comments until I see the other part of the proposal, because I'm personally fine with what our work group worked on, but I'm also happy to look further.
Yeah, that's so I put in the chat a 1.2, if you wanna look at that, we can pull it up. I think it gets to a lot of what you guys are trying to get at with like the movement. I just spent some time in an afternoon trying to think through that and make sure we were more clear. So there it is. So in full disclosure, I had a conversation with I had with the research biologist. One of the things I was asking him was, does this make sense when we say this, when we say genetic demographics? And they were like, I don't know what that means. And so then I was like, well, it stems off of some of the work going on in the HG Andrews, and they're like, oh, well, why don't you just say, for example, but they said genetics is one way to get at population connectivity. It's not the only way. There's lots of different ways you could propose, you could put a proposal together and look at that. But if you want us to sort of focus in on something, then you can suggest, methods in another study. So that's how I came up with that verbiage. Just trying to be very clear how our population's connected across watersheds. Because I think that's the question that you guys are, that I think Casey and Wendy, you guys were very interested in and putting forward. And so I wasn't meaning to erase it out of question one. I was just trying to clarify so that it was as clear as possible when we give it to IRST.
Okay, so you're saying for the 1.1, we can just like whittle out some of the stuff related to population connectivity because that's 1.2?
No, I mean, I think 1.1 can stand alone and then you just have 1.2. Those are just,
Okay.
yeah, and they're just two separate questions.
Go back to that last slide, Sarah, the 1.1, and just delete the purple.
Okay.
Get rid of that. Don't need it. And then maybe just change that to question 1.1.
And then you could even, if you guys were comfortable with that, you don't even really need that first bullet point. Because you're explicitly asking the question in question 1.2. So you don't need to, it doesn't need to be seen as implied in 1.1. It's explicit in 1.2,
Oh, yeah, I think Sarah was just,
right?
Just
reflecting.
getting it
her-
Right, no, I get it. No, I understand. I'm just,
Cool, yeah.
Get that suggested.
Sorry, thank you. PowerPoint? Sorry.
I'll see what does that. Just take a look at 1.1 and if you can, sorry.
Going back to the, sorry. I need to go back. So. Okay.
Have a carry on conversation.
No, you just have yours out, sorry.
I have a question for 1.1, and hopefully this doesn't throw a wrench into things, so you just give me a look. So to, protect the interests that I represent in this group, I wanna make sure that we're also collecting baseline information on things for distribution that aren't just habitat related, but that have to do with or what I would like, or what I'm suggesting is other things that have to do with the weather, the climate, things that also might affect the distribution and population and persistence of a species that we can come back to, because what I would be worried about is all we collect information on is the habitat. And then we can't really opine, or the researchers can't really opine in the future when we get to sort of more monitoring and referring back to that baseline on, was it actually a forest operation that affected the population, or was there something else happening in the environment that caused a reaction in the distribution or persistence of the species? I don't really know how we get there, but I would be interested in that, kind of to the point of collecting, maybe erring on the side of collecting too much information so that we can go back and look at correlation and causation factors across different pieces of information. So I'm just throwing it out there because just to protect, I mean, I have to think about the interests that I serve. So I don't know how to get there. Maybe you guys can help me.
Well, a lot of it, so like the weather is collected by state and federal agencies. Flow persistence is being worked on a lot by USGS and VFW, and that would be an important factor. So I think I agree, because we need to be able to look at all the pieces. In addition to habitat, and climate can certainly have big impact on cold water species. But I think a lot of that kind of situational information is probably already being collected. I've gone back and, well, what's the weather doing? I've been able to pull stuff from records that go back to the 70s even on weather.
I'm just thinking about the fact that weather stations don't exist right where we're taking samples, and you can have microclimates and other things that are occurring that may not be picked up by weather stations. So on
That could be
a,
the reason why they're there, or the reason they're not.
yeah, and at a very coarse
Yeah,
scale,
valid.
that might work, but I'm just, yeah, I'm just thinking about how we might come to a conclusion 10, 15 years from now that may or may not be the right conclusion. And our only tool that we have is the Forest Practice Act, and so we see everything as that hammer of, okay, well, obviously it was the forest activity that caused the problem. So just trying to get around that, and not saying that we might not, I mean, that might be a problem, right? But I would love to find a way to kind of incorporate in the baseline.
Other explanatory variables.
Yeah, other variables that might be of interest to have some information on, paired with this other sort of place-based.
I think Amanda, that would information for a robust network of reference sites. Like sites on,
Well, and
on less managed lands like wilderness or federal lands, like within, for example, the late successional reserves. On federal lands or so on. I think that's, if I were designing this study, that's what I'd be looking at. Is what can I do for reference sites that are gonna be experiencing those same high level changes, but will have different management signals. To just entangle that, especially reference sites that are near to, you know, experimental sites or private forest monitoring sites.
I could jump in real quick, and I did see Wendy and Casey, but I guess
Where's our hiding?
the thought that came to my mind was maybe we just ask the IRST how they would design for that question.
Yeah.
Like the policy question is like, what are those other variables that?
Yeah.
Or, you know,
We
how
can't
are
actually
you?
answer the policy question, sorry, without knowing, being able to disentangle a private
Yeah.
forest signal from other things going on signal.
How are you, how would you assess reference conditions or something like that? I don't know, maybe we could just ask them, I guess, is what I'm trying to.
Don't lose that question, because that really is the critical one.
Could you just do a placeholder, Sarah, that's like a 1.3, some question about
other
conditions to IRST?
other potential explanatory variables.
But if I can raise my thing, to me, like the baseline is not really a causation based. part of this anyways. To me, it confuses it a little analytically to start having a 1.3 that's focusing on, I would think your point, which I take would be perhaps better worked into the following, like the 2 point something parts of this. Because to me, the baseline is just what is there?
Yeah.
And then when you're talking about, causation and variables that might have affected it, other than forest practices, that's more for the second part.
I think you're probably right. Still a valid point.
Yeah.
That you're bringing up, but maybe it's in a different.
Maybe it's in a different question.
Yeah.
I just, the thought came to mind, so I wanted to get it out there.
So Casey, you had, yeah, and then, oh,
I
Somebody
had
was
my
Yeah,
hand up.
Julie's had her
I'm
hand
gonna
up.
interject. So I think we've already kind of addressed that in 1.1 in the parentheses. And maybe we could just, switch one of those out for something that seems more that's what I do is aquatic habitat and including climate variables and flow and, the way that is worded, I would assume that was part of it, but maybe not everybody would. So, if it'd make you feel more comfortable to have another example in there that sort of alludes to those sort of data, I think we've already set it up that way.
there's something you would suggest, Julie, for that list that would help?
You're on mute, Julie.
You could say temperature, which would get you outside of the physical habitat, which most of the other stuff is.
I guess. Okay, so you had yours first.
I mean, I think we're still on your question, but I do wanna, I was gonna ask, like, does this get at some of the things you're thinking about? Cause it sounded like it was more about how were the existing legacy or current practices affecting, how are they in space and time associated with the absence or presence of an amphibian? And it was that, cause I was thinking about things like road crossings, like. Do we know if road crossings are beneficial to the covered species, or do we know if they're harmful to? And was that what you're thinking? No.
No, I mean, I'm thinking more about like the part of the question that is asking for, even at smaller spatial scales, so ergo watersheds, and sort of the question around intra watershed, what is that,
Mhm.
when it's in watershed.
Intra, yeah.
Right? Like microclimate, right? Like there's can be unique features at a given time and location that maybe make a specific area more habitable or less habitable for the species. And so how do we make sure that we're collecting data on that so that in the future, when we go back and reference this baseline, that we have that information, which is then whatever the word is,
Juxtaposed.
With activity information, with the actual like harvest operations and because eventually at some point we will get to kind of the effectiveness monitoring piece, right, of forest practice rules.
So we found amphibians there this time. We went back, didn't find them. There was a harvest that occurred, a timber harvest, but there was also aliens that came down that sucked up all the amphibians.
So was it
But as I look at in the Tillamook forest, the death of trees that's changing from a broadleaf to a conifer type now because of the death of trees. Is that what really caused the loss of or addition of amphibians. So there is something there that is beyond the actual action of management, that is more global, that needs to be understood. It's maybe it's the amount of sunlight, maybe it's the amount of, I don't know what it is, but there is something else there.
Yeah, and to the point of like, okay, well, maybe we focus that in the future questions. I guess I'm not a scientist, I'm a policy. So if we're gonna be collecting data in the future about that, is there something we also need to be collecting now that kind of coordinates with that, is my question, and I don't know the answer to that.
I mean, we'll be doing I mean, that strikes me, could be answered in a couple ways, right? I mean, to Josh's point. Sorry, I didn't have my thing up, but I'm jumping in front of Casey, sorry.
That's okay.
But Josh's point is a valid one. You do have broad information, right, that is collected at different, but it doesn't get to some of the very fine, which is also a very good point. Some of those fine spatial scales are very important. But we will also have, and we are anticipating long-term monitoring going on, like that will monitor stream. I'm anticipating anyway that once we get to that question, which is a few months down the road, we'll start to outline what are the different things we're going to be monitoring. And I would imagine it will be things like temperature and stream flow and large woody debris. So some of those things might also impact and be variables like what you're saying. So, but it could also be asked in the individual questions, right? And so when you ask the question later about, the ELZ or whatever, what is the impact of an ELZ for the species? You could ask the question, and, exploring other variables or ensuring that they, track other potential explanatory variables.
Yeah. I don't know, I don't know how to address it, you guys are smarter than me on this, so.
We're all figuring it out together. I like I mean, you said, oh, sorry. I was trying to move as far. Was someone online?
Great, but. Julie, how are you?
Julie, did you have your hand up?
Briefly, I don't know that what I have to contribute is actually useful, but I think we should be cautious about trying to go into the minutia of every single thing that somebody might consider, because of the fact, I think that the biologists who'll be writing this proposal know better than we do what kinds of things they should be evaluating. And that the confusion over the minutia can dilute the real question that we have. If the core of the question, Amanda, is, that we want information that's both management related and not management related, then maybe that's all we have to say. That we're, including covariates, both management related and non-management related covariates in that little parentheses thing, no extra bullets or questions, or just, within that parentheses and something less than a line, give some examples and, say that we want those covariates to address management actions and just ecology.
So Julie, I like that suggestion. I'm just gonna try to word edit here on the fly.
Yeah.
What you after and what factors. I think you said it well, including both management and non-management related variables. But maybe that's just a comma, but there's a lot of punctuation happening.
If that's good. Okay, I mean, mostly, well, I would like to make sure that this 1.1 or 1.2 retains some of the information that's in the kind of like workshop with the question that we've worked on many times in the past, and that's seasonality. Because if a researcher tells a field worker to go out in the summer and they find an amphibian in the stream, that amphibian may not be there. They may be upland, they may be downstream at a different time of the year. And if we're making policy decisions based upon this torrent is here at this time, when it might not always be there, and I'm pointing towards you, just because trying to think about the practices, right? That we may be, if we're not asking them to look for this particular thing, we may be just wasting a forest practice operators like attention and their time and their money for something that's not actually relevant. And so I just wanted to flag that it would be great to have something about seasonality, temperature, or the seasonality, or like the temporal scale of things in there. The other thing I would ask is what, we don't have anything about, hey, this can include a literature review, and that was part of the original workshop question. So I want to bring that one in, if we think that we need to call out the value of a literature review, knowing that we can do that anyway. And then the last thing is just that Oregon Wild all the time talks about like, what is management? And I don't know if we're capable in the time we have here to define and tease apart the different aspects of management. We believe that not doing anything is management. And so just recognizing that temperature of a stream is related to management, I think we can all agree to that to some level. It's going to be hard unless there's specific things that we want to say that are different than management versus non-management related. Okay, I think I got all my annoying points out.
Yeah, appreciate that. You see, and maybe we went on a side tangent to try to address, and we can go back and rework that.
Sorry, Chair, I just derailed the whole meeting.
This might be.
I think it's important to think about it.
I was just gonna put in a slight time check here because we were supposed to take a break, and I was gonna propose 10 more minutes on this one, take a break. Come back and try to tackle question 2, but I feel like we maybe have unpacked a little more discussion, so Wendy, and then I'm gonna see where we are, because I think we maybe.
But my
went
own little
astray.
temperature taking of myself is that I feel we're drifting a little bit away. I still feel like the working group did a really good job. And I kind of like the way they associated, though I take the point about watershed connectivity maybe needing to be stated slightly differently in there. Otherwise, I kind of like it. And again, I feel like when we start drifting into suggesting that the baseline has to include conclusions or statements about causation, that's going to be, I think, a very expansive way of thinking about it. And I think that probably better reserved for somewhere else than our question 1.
Yes, very fair points taken. Maybe let's take a look at question 1 in red track changes, which is what the work group worked on with some fresh eyes.
Hanging on to some of the old stuff, huh?
Given our conversation around variables and factors and stuff, I think your EG list of things is a good addition. Amanda?
Yeah, I think my point is, Sarah, I think you called it micro habitats, but like microsite, microclimate, like that's really what I'm trying to get at, is like those sites, that site specific information that to me is important, is just as important to document as the other pieces around aspect, flow, like all of that stuff is important to be aware of with the baseline, to me, I think. And so I think it's as easy as indicating that, one of those things, like, I agree, I think, Julie, I think you're on the right track with the management and non-management. I don't know that those are the right words for the question.
Yeah.
But I just want to make sure that something around like microsite, microclimate is included in kind of the listing of the variables that we're interested in, and they can determine, because those are that's like a category of things, right? And so they can determine what are those variables within, you know, how we think about a microsite or a microclimate that is important to capture in the actual data gathering methodology. So that's what I'm trying to get at, I think, if that's helpful
So
framing.
I think the management, non-management, I think is not quite right. So if we can delete that in parentheses, yeah, up at the top. And if you can move the EG back into the sentence. That whole list of stream gradient, stream size, and make sure we have microhabitat in there.
And do you like, you didn't love microhabitat?
I never heard that before, but maybe others have.
I think that is getting at what you're interested in.
Microhabitat.
Clear enough.
Yeah, I've just never heard that before, but I'm a tree person, not a, yeah.
And in biology,
I've heard
it's
science
just
phrase,
take all that
every-
data. You're talking about like that's standard on the sheet for what it's, yeah.
Yeah,
Finally, safe sites, yeah.
and I would imagine, I envisioned that this would be that some of that would be part of what those examples of stream gradient, stream size, I think they would also measure, adjacent riparian area, sort of makeup, is this a fresh harvest? Does it have, 50-year-old trees, conifer, or is it alder dominated site? I would examine, I mean, I would expect that some of those factors would be collected.
If
So-
we're doing,
Yeah, so I like it the way Sarah has it now with the addition of seasonality in there. And I don't really wanna. Alright, this is like, we should stay in our lane.
Yes.
We're getting too much, I think, into trying to tell the scientist how to scientist, and we don't need to do that. We need to stay in our lane. So I think this is pretty good. It's got good examples. It covers the seasonality of microsite conditions. But beyond that, I think we need to I think this is good. I think we should go on break, and we should stop trying to tell the scientists how to be scientists.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's kind of where I'm at.
I had this moment where I was like, I don't see the seasonality, and then you typed
Sorry.
it, and I was like, are you reading me? And so one, just, okay. One just can, caution, I guess, is that, this, what we've discussed is really supposed, a new study, and if we're looking at other information as a baseline, a literature review, it may not have some of those things, like the microhabitat, why did I find the species in this particular location? So
Yeah,
just,
and that's what I would
Yeah, the
anticipate.
obvious.
That's kind of what my thought was. Like the broader crayon exercise, probably you might be able to get that with all the species with a literature review. But this sort of specificity, which I think is really important for us to make policy decisions down the road, is gonna be, some of this, maybe there is literature already done on it. But others, there probably won't be, and so they'll need to.
Just to be clear, are we, by going from Q1 to Q1.1, are we taking out the reference to the robust literature review? thought
I
we were
didn't
keeping
anticipate that,
in.
so
I think we should put it in.
I'm fine if we
Oh,
wanna add that back in as you're suggesting, Casey, I am not opposed to that at all.
Need a colon.
I like the idea of the efficiency of seeing what's out there.
Mhm.
Starting point.
Yep,
Just a quick question with the lit review, are you suggesting do lit review and field, or start with a lit review to see where things stand? And then we'll revisit.
Go ahead.
I would say we just want to leave that open to the IRST or their contractor to determine. That's what I'm there for.
you did great, Sarah.
I'm used to doing it myself, so I'm sorry.
Your brain's
Brain
brain.
cells. Okay.
Exactly.
That is a hard job. If you could delete the bulleted, just so we can see it super clean.
Yeah.
I saw Amanda, you put your hand up, and then I'm gonna take a pause. We're gonna look at this, we're gonna take a break, we're gonna come back.
Okay, just for the record, for 1.1, I I really appreciate where we're at. I just want to say that on the record, because if we're gonna identify any of the any of the, variables, or, put the variables in there behind the EG in the parentheses, that is where I thought it was important to include the microsite stuff, the microhabitat stuff. If we left all that out and just said what factors, I could have probably been okay with that. But if we do feel like it's important from a policy perspective to include some of them, that's why I wanted to include that. So that's my perspective on that.
Can
I
I
have
ask
maybe some other perspectives on 1.2 when we get back. Right,
a quick edit? Rather than starting with conduct, could you put include?
Yeah, sorry.
I
went
think
right
that's the way
there.
our original. our original
It was.
thank you.
Yeah, including.
And did you like the? Is it like implying?
I think that's fine.
Okay, we're gonna take a.
You got me right there.
Period, and then take out the extra. Robusta.
Oh.
Hey Terry, you wanna pause the recording?
No, I think it was.
And then I'll remind you to re-record when
That's attempt to kind of pull out a particular element of that, which I think, but I do have that as. I guess genetic demographics, with that sort of the attempt to. Better define, better describe what we're really interested in for 1.2. So maybe I'll just open it up for 1.2 and see. If folks have initial thoughts on that. I can't see anyone online, I apologize.
Nobody has their hand raised online. Julie and Jason, I'm not sure are back, so they don't have their cameras on. So if you are back, if you could let us know, Julie and Jason.
I have a question. I didn't know that was still up. So for the work group and just kind of thinking back to the question, the conversations we were having before around this topic of genetic demographics, are we, if we are wanting to focus in on like the H.J. Andrews, they're using eDNA, I think. Do we want to identify anything around eDNA? And are we looking at, as it relates to genetics, are we interested in the diversity of genes in the ability for the species to persist, or just trying to understand exactly where we're trying to get at with the genetics conversation?
I'm happy to take a crack at it, but I heard some mm-hms, so maybe the mm-hms. So it's important to understand if we're asking about baseline, where amphibians are in the landscape, it's important to understand the difference between populations. And it's been with regard to, there might be a population that's 3 watersheds. There might be one that they're breeding with an adjacent watershed. And then up here, there's another distinct population that's breeding with this one, but is not breeding with this one. So eDNA would be a presence absence as opposed to determining the difference between populations at the genetic level. So please take out eDNA. In other words. I don't want to get us stuck on that. So again.
I just was gonna say, like, because I was thinking about something like consider genetic diversity.
Sure.
Does that not fit with eDNA?
I'm happy to yield the floor to other people since there were some intakes of breath in that one.
Well, I was gonna say, I think we're veering into what Josh described as, maybe focusing too much on the methods, and we should let the IRST experts sort of focus on that, but if there's a way to better describe or better define what we want to understand rather than prescribing a specific technique. And I think if I'm recalling right, Seth, that you included the H.J. Andrews as an example that would help inform the IRST.
Yeah, and I guess it would probably be better to consider the methods within the work being done in the H.J. Andrews, not just like consider their study, but consider the methods. That's really what I was trying to get at. Because I think that was originally what Casey was interested in referencing that study. I will say, you know, from my perspective, I'm not sure this question is, you know, taking my sort of co-chair hat off and just from my perspective, I'm not sure this question is really how should I put it, vital in the forest practices. Like if we find the species, right? So my point is this, like our requirement under the ESA is to make sure the species persist and even you know, does well within the context of the HCP. Now, how connected they are is not really our, and as my understanding anyway, that's not a bar at which we are measured to try to increase diversity, decrease diversity. It's more of, you know, are they persisting? And assuming that if they're persisting, then they're reproducing within a scope that is reasonable for their existence. So I'm not saying I'm not trying to throw cold water on this 1.2 because I know it is of interest to some of you, and I think that the connection, you know, there's some interesting question there. I think it's an academically interesting question. I'm not sure it has a lot of applicability for forest practices. So.
Sweet, I'm happy to share with you goal 3, which is goal 3 is stream network connectivity satisfied freshwater habitat needs for covered species. So connectivity is like a vitally important part of the biological goals and objectives. And it's because we need to know what goes into the factors that make species persist.
And I'm fine with freshwater connectivity of so anyway, I'm just saying that the biologic diversity of species, I don't know how broadly that falls under our real, but.
I think we got here, right, because, and even in the work group, based on your version, it was genetic demographics, and if that feels like a better place to be, I think your effort was to try to better describe what we mean by genetic demographics, but if just including genetic demographics within 1.1 or sort of going back to the work group version maybe gets us there. Because I think we had some more alignment around this is an important component of a baseline assessment that we would want to understand for these species. And I don't want to get us too wrapped around sort of the specific wording of that. We don't need to go down that road.
That's fine with me, like, the language.
Okay.
What are you gonna say?
Predictably, I'll say what I said before, I kind of like the way it says in the working group.
You know, we could strike demographic from question 1 and just put an S at the end of genetics. Oh. Sorry, I'm looking at our homework.
Do you wanna, if Sarah goes to the black text?
Oh, sure.
do you wanna
I can
sort of
focus,
help
yeah.
direct? I'm
Yeah.
not totally sure.
Yeah,
what-
sorry, I'm switching between things here.
We're thinking for 1.1, right, incorporating something that has to do with genetics.
Yeah. I mean, probably it would go as a parenthetical statement after distribution. including genetics. right? And then close parentheses within Oregon. Because really, I guess that the going, because it is a macro scale, right, is what are we talking about when we're talking about species, right? And the species has, the scientists are gonna science, is that what we said earlier? Yeah, no, I said that Sarah brained me, so we can make up new words or new uses of old words. And really, it's about, okay, we've got these species and then we've got distinct populations, right? And then we've got populations that are breeding with each other and understanding which is a distinct population, which is a population that's breeding with another one, and what is the distinction between one species and another, and where's that line is part of the distribution. Because otherwise we're just saying, hey, is there a wriggly thing on the ground that doesn't seem to mind being wet all the time? Is it there or not? Often. Often, that's right. It's often not there.
So potentially we would be deleting 1.2. We have now added to make sure that the concept of genetic demographics is included in 1.1.
And then that would take away some of the concerns, or it would address the observation about the connected across watersheds.
I'm okay either way. I wasn't trying to say that I would stop that. I was just trying to be more clear in 1.2. And I was just trying to say that from my perspective, I don't think it's necessary. It's a necessary part of the question to help us move forward. That said, I'm not gonna stand in the way of it. I wasn't trying to, that's why I'm not gonna throw a wet blanket over it. I was just voicing my thoughts.
Anyone online? Can't see you.
And nobody has their hand raised online.
Oh, thanks, Jerry. You have a last comment, Amanda, otherwise I'm going to move us on to question 2.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to understand the connection to the HCP and the expectations of the federal services. I think Casey, you highlighted goal 3, but goal 3 is specific to stream network connectivity, so trying to figure out where, because under the ESA, private lands they're not responsible for species recovery.
They're responsible for persistence, yeah.
Yeah, they're responsible for persistence, or that's the key point there. And then not kind of having to take a permit, it's not a permit, but we're not trying to identify like distinct populations or something like that. So on the genetic side, if the responsibility is just to have the species persist, then what is the importance to understanding distinct populations?
Perfect, thank you. Actually, a couple of months ago, I shared, but it's been a while, so I won't belabor it, but it's the question, right? Thank you for that. Populations will only persist when they are large enough, and they're mobile enough, and they have connectivity to be able to freely mix in order to maintain a population size that's conducive to health for that particular species. While we might not be, we actually do talk about distinct populations for aquatic species. So just for fish. So we are talking about that. That is the realm in which we are existing. But for the idea of a species persisting, we do need to know its genetics, because if practices in one place isolate a population from another population, and the population becomes too small because they're not genetically mixing with it, they're not doing it, then we risk the persistence of the species. Does that make sense? All in private land, there's a risk because of the risk of genetic not mixing. Yes, inbreeding, right? And the value, sorry, you were about to say something, but the real value and importance for amphibians, especially as I understand it, I'm not a scientist, but I have a degree, right, is that amphibian populations can be populations, especially on watershed scale, can be wiped out like that by the kind of disturbance factors that exist on the landscape. And if they can't move between watersheds, and I say over, but it's like you can go down one stream and go up another stream. Let's say it's not going through spaces that aren't subject to the riparian rules or whatever. If you can't go between populations and you can't go between habitats, then you risk the species not persisting.
I guess my question, and again, I'm not a wildlife biologist, but isn't the whole point that we're allowed incidental take by having these really onerous restrictions now? So I'm not trying to be insensitive here that,
I mean, it's
if
a
fewer
great,
amphibians die, is that okay? And I don't know, I mean,
Right,
I'm
so-
guessing yes, that's why we have an incidental take burn.
fantastic question. The forest practices that might lead to, say, a landslide, shallow, fast moving landslide that wipes out a population, that is incidental take, right? The feds are like, yes, that's okay. No, that's not okay. We don't have that yet, but just to be clear, right? Take isn't okay, and until we have a take permit, then it's take avoidance. But in the case of, say, the biological goals and objectives or the habitat conservation plan, and us being here in this space right now, is we're saying we probably don't have enough information to say for certain that we're doing X thing in order to have, and for them to be okay with us doing incidental take, right? And so we're trying to figure out what are the things that are happening on the landscape. I'm mansplaining to you right now, sorry. For amphibians, right? Because we don't necessarily know, and that's why we're here as the adaptive management. Because we don't necessarily have all the questions, or sorry, all the answers.
I think I don't want us to spend too much time on this because we have discussed it at the last meeting and the work group, and I think there was this idea of genetic demographics has made it through to this point, and I guess I would think of it as maybe similar to interest in looking at the habitat, that there's interest in looking at this element. And I would propose that we consider the conversation and the concerns, but unless there's like really major red flag with that one, that we can move forward to question 2, because I think we're really getting close here.
Yeah.
Unless Seth is gonna say.
No, I'm not gonna take us off. I'm not gonna take us off. No. I was just gonna, I think when we forward, if we forward question 1.1 as is, I'm fine with that and I would support that. Well, I think we're gonna get a question back as to what do you mean by that? And I think the question then is, do we, and I think maybe even we still do that, but what I'm trying to do is take the temperature here. 1.2, does 1.2 further clarify what you're getting at by adding in population connectivity across watersheds? Because if I'm hearing you correctly, that's really the question that you have, right? It's not necessarily, genetics is a way to get at that. But the question you have is the connection between watersheds, species across.
To answer question,
populations.
so great question. I think simply to answer question 1.2, the answer will be based in genetics. And genetic, the demography of the population, that how many X, how many XX, how many XY, and where are they located? I think that's in question 1.1, which would be the answer to question 1.2.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is yes. The 1.2 we are really kind of talking about population connectivity across watershed.
I think
But
so.
genetics likely is the primary way to answer that.
I think so.
That's kind of what you're saying, right? Okay, I just want to make sure. And so if we erase 1.2, I'm fine with that for now. I just want to, because I think we're going to get a follow-up question. And I think having the conversation and at least understanding what your interest there is and making sure that I understand it will help us answer when the question comes.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So are we landing on just having question one and including including genetics as the way, and then leaving off 1.2? Is that where we're landing right now?
I'm fine either way.
I think that was under consideration. I thought we had alignment around including some concept of genetic demographics, and then we've been back and forth on sort of the best way to articulate that. And so I think the question, maybe for you, Casey, if 1.2 as it's written there better articulates what we're trying to understand, or if it's captured enough in 1.1. I think I'm hearing generally people are okay with either one, unless Amanda's gonna say differently.
She's like have that taller if he's kind of a little.
Maybe I should
A little higher.
alternative.
I was just, I'm fine with how it is. I was just gonna ask, thinking about genetic health, if there's any other health markers that would be important for us to be including in the variables. If we're gonna kind of get to genetic health, should we also talk about other health pieces? Kind of getting back to my point, not to go back to the future situation, but around things that might affect the persistence of the species beyond just the forest activities.
Like me, oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, based on my knowledge of amphibians, as granted is somewhat limited, but I really was struck by the fact that the thing the scientists emphasized was the health that's involved in genetic diversity, so I think it's appropriate to highlight that. We're just saying including, I think that they could possibly include other factors if they could come back to us and say, oh, you're overlooking this one key thing. But to me, it seems to me like there's a reason for singling out genetics as a health factor and letting them come back on other health things if they feel that's necessary.
And that could be another question if we do have a joint meeting, but just to put a marker down.
Yeah, I think it's an important question to ask, maybe not in this one. But yeah, that might be the best time for it.
Thinking about other factors and getting them.
Well, I think the way we've articulated it leaves some room for IRSD expertise to add on and maybe flag things we haven't thought of. And we have also signaled where we are most focused in. So I'm gonna take us off of 1.1 because I think it's really close. And just again,
Is it
it's a
just one
reminder.
now? Is it just one again?
It's just one. Because there's.
What's the question one?
Because there's no other one.
Just gonna.
Because remember, one point
Other. Question one, which is our baseline question, all species literature review, and we have identified some specific factors we are most interested in, but have also given space for IRST with their expertise included. So with that in mind, let's shift to question two, which I think be hesitant to say, seems a little more straightforward. And again, we have had a meeting, at least one meeting on this. The work group did some finessing of the question two sections, which are really big picture, right? Focus on the two torrent salamanders, and then the sub questions focusing on the different rule sections that are potentially most likely to affect, or there's most sort of intersections with their habitat, and we would want to understand those. So.
Do you want me to add a little bit more color to it?
Sure.
Now that we're at this point, I was hesitant too during like, hey, let's talk about this in general. So I think a question that we have to just kind of focus the folks who weren't in the meeting is if we're focusing just on, well, that's a question, is do we want to focus on Columbian torrent, the southern torrents? But because those are in general higher up in watersheds, it may be a moot point to ask about fish bearing streams, for example, or no harvest RMAs. And so the question to you all is, do we keep questions here that may not have a habitat overlap or distributional overlap?
Well, I think the question of fish crossing, for example, one of the things that I saw in that question was, it could be talking about predators that you're now introducing, right? So if there was a blockage before, now that blockage isn't there. Now fish are moving upstream, how is that impacting foreign salamanders in the area? Right, and so I think there is more than just the salamander itself moving, there's a connection to the restoring the salmoniid habitat as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's the rules for road crossings, and
Right.
not just the fishery streams.
I guess to that end, I had a question about habitat. And you know, if we want to focus on habitat or more on species persistence or something else, I think the PFA language specifically talks about species persistence, not necessarily habitat, but habitat could be surrogate and we can control habitat. So kind of to the point of Seth for this specific question, you know, maybe it makes more sense to focus on habitat for the other you know, 2 point, et cetera, questions. But if this one is gonna be focused more on predation, 1, should we say that? And 2, should we not have it be focused on habitat if it's really around predation and the presence and the new introduction of fish after removing barriers?
Sorry, I think maybe we already drilled down into, which one are you looking at?
2.1.
The roads.
Mm-hmm.
I have a related comment.
Yeah.
Tonight, I had made the comment in the draft that shows up in the margin, kind of a funny place, but it has to do with the overarching goal, because under the biological goals and objectives, it says that the forest practices that support the survival and recovery of covered species by providing clean, cool, connected, and complex habitats. So I thought that it would be appropriate to put, so where it says each question is connected to the associated goal and objectives, I think putting the overarching goal in there makes sense, because otherwise it sort of creates parcelization of our overarching goal, but doesn't emphasize what we're really aiming at in the picture. But to me, it would go in question 2, because it used to say these BGOs are : and then that was deleted. And now it refers to associated goal and objective, but I think we should put the overarching goal there as well.
Is that almost like an introduction sentence?
So I think,
Are we
sorry,
actually on the
can you
next
send on the
slide?
next one, that's the work group, the track changes one, yeah, maybe. Make that a little bigger. Sorry.
Or make it, maybe make it black, the
Yeah.
red is hard to see.
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So Wendy, you were just proposing to keep that, the edit that you added there, that last sentence.
Well, there was just a margin note, it didn't, all of my text wasn't there, but below in the document, it lists all the biological goals and objectives, and at the very top of that is the overarching goal, which is the one I read out loud. And I think it makes sense to put into what the overarching goal is. So you could, I don't know, like grab that text from down below. Or just I can read it, you look in the document, it's down where it's.
It's also down at the bottom of question 2.6.
Right, yes.
For
You can
folks that
move-
don't want to scroll.
To move it up and make it clear that that's what we're aiming into. It's my proposal.
And I think for the record, we want to also keep it on question 2.6.
Yes, because it's very there.
So Sarah, I can just read that out to you.
Yeah, that'd be
That's
great.
okay.
Thank you. And I'll just, do we know where we want that sentence in here, or I'll just type it out?
Into. Sorry, I've lost my, I was reading and now I've lost my back out. So I put it. Sorry, I lost my spot here.
you want me to just read it?
I completely,
Sorry. Alright, forest practices that support survival and recovery
now I can.
of secondary species. Species.
I should type a lot more slowly when people are watching you.
I do a lot of deleting.
Just to say,
so-
that's what I was looking for, that's what I meant, to put it.
By providing clean, cool, acid, and complex habitat. So your proposal, Wendy, would be each question is connected to the following goal, overarching goal.
I would be like, each question is connected to the associated goal and objective, because this very specific sub-goals are down below, but I think it makes
As
sense
well as
to
the
include
overarching goal.
the overarching goal. So you could be associated goal and objective comment, including the overarching goal of quote, forest practices that support survival and recovery, et cetera. Yeah, thank you.
So more of a framing edit, I think there, just to reorient around the intent, right, of these questions.
What is that again?
Sorry, more of a framing edit, not substance.
Right, I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
it is a framing edit. I think that primary goal is called a quote overarching goal. Down below where we say the VGOs are listed, it just seems to me putting that earlier to frame the little sub goals that are below and 2.1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever, makes sense.
Right, because essentially question two, the beginning of that is the generic. However, these species, these particular species persisting over time in the landscape, and we're gonna give you the biological goal and objective on the sub questions, and the overarching goal is up there in the overarching question.
You said it more clearly than I, yes.
So I'm just gonna take us a big step back here, because question one, I think we're on the same page, all the species, baseline question. I think everyone is okay with the question two bucket being focused on the torrent salamanders. And we discussed this in our last meeting, and the work group made some tweaks. I think there's questions around the BGOs that are listed here, and there may be questions around the particular rule sections that have been called out. But I sort of calling on Terry here, I don't think you got any specific comments, right, in the time that we all had to review question two. Which
Correct.
doesn't necessarily
Yeah.
mean everyone is good with it, but I'm hoping that it means that we're a little bit closer here, because there are a lot of sub questions, and I think we could, like we did for question one, spend a lot of time going down the rabbit hole. So I'm curious, any of these that are really problematic, or like, you know, road crossings, this isn't an appropriate one to include, maybe let's start there, or does this list generally look good?
I think it's generally appropriate, all of these questions. I am nitpicking.
Okay.
I'm generally okay.
Okay.
I'm generally think it's okay.
Okay, so just to recap, so that would be related to road crossings on fish bearing streams. 2.2 related to the no harvest RMAs. 2.3 rules for type N. 2.4 rules for stream associated wetlands and stream adjacent seeps and springs. 2.5 rules related to steep unstable slopes. And that
And
is-
just for clarification, in the conversation with the work group, they did not want to, at this stage of the game, list all the rules for each of these, even though they recognized that was important. But rather get some help from the IRST, since each one of these questions is quite large, and try and get some help, and correct me if I'm wrong, work group members, but to try and narrow the focus by prioritizing which of these questions is the most important at this stage of the game. Because if you send it all of them, then everything's a priority, and which means nothing is a priority. And then once those those are prioritized, you know, it's 2.2 is the most important or whatever, then we can hone into the specific rules pertinent to that question.
If I may, question 2.6 to me seems to be the one. So I'm just gonna jump into that prioritizing question. But
And those are not in the PowerPoint, those are in the Word document. The other 2.2 through 2.6. So maybe switching to that, or I'm not sure how best you want to address that.
Sarah.
Okay.
But 2.6 is the one that talks about the persistence of this salamander over time.
Right there.
And the landscape, right?
Is it-
Yeah,
is
that's
it the
it.
right thing?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're in the right,
Okay.
choosing the right one, right?
You know, sometimes it does your screen and sometimes it does your window.
And at the time, like, as I look at these questions, and I think about if I was a researcher trying to figure out, A, what's the higher priority to like start something now? And then B, how would I couple some of these things together? It makes the most sense to me anyway, in my brain, that you would look at question one, when you're going out there to set that baseline. And you would also come up with a proposal that would be coupled with that would measure persistence over time, right? So you'd maybe have, you'd figure out where your sample sites are to figure out where they exist on the landscape demographics, you know, habitat conditions, all these sorts of things that you're doing in question one. And then you'd also have some sort of monitoring effort outline that you for answering question 2.6. So in my mind, it makes sense to prioritize 2.6 high on this list so you could start to monitor that species. And then these other questions seem to be more of like a traditional kind of before after, you know, Baki design or whatever type study where you're comparing what's happened in one place with what's not happened in another. You know, where are we seeing the species move and how are they adjusting to that? And there's several different ways to accomplish that and different scales and things like that, but those are more kind of, in my mind, one-off questions. Whereas 2.6 and question one are more sort of looking at population dynamics.
Can I just ask a clarifying question for the work group? Why is that to me, that sort of could be its own standalone question, like maybe that should be question 2. The other ones are 3.1,
Could be.
3.2, 3.3, because I agree that would also be a high priority question. And seems different than the other ones. It gets a little lost as a.
To me, logically, would seem to make sense to take your good comment into account, just to move from 0.6 up. That's a way of implicitly prioritizing it. I think it logically links to 1.
Would you propose it as its
I
own?
probably wouldn't put it in a separate question because the introduction to 2 says instead of a question that addresses habitat and persistence. So I think you could put 2.6 under it and call it 2.1.
Yeah, so that one of I got a couple of nitpicks. One is 2.6 is the species persisting? And 2.1 through 2.5 is why or why not? Those are the different pieces of why or why not. So glad we got that before this is my turn. Because 2.6 is like, that's kind of really what is about. And then the rest is why or why not. And then I like them all. I think the work group did a great job. So like my appreciation to the people in the work group. On 2.1, it's I get why it says road crossings on fish bearing streams. Because there's an objective specifically for that, but goal 3 is the network connectivity. I would like to delete the on fish bearing part because these 2 salamanders in particular are moving up and down the non-fish network. And so we need to know if crossings on the non-fish network are creating a barrier for them. Are they like refusing to move down? One thing that one of the OSU scientists told me, I don't know if everyone caught it, was that even like the natural bottom culverts, they don't really like them because they want a natural bank culvert. And so we have a culvert, an arched culvert with a nice substrate that's full, it's just stream all the way and then metal wall. They don't like that. They want a place where they're not in the current, not in the water, but it's nice and wet and they can ramble along the bank for their movement. So for this one, I think we would probably, for what's currently question 2.1, I think we wanna just really focus on the goal 3 part of it and delete the crossings on streams. Rather than just fish bearing streams, because especially for the torrent salamanders, the non-fish network and connectivity on it's hugely important.
Yes, let's pause for 1 second and just make sure that that's reflected, so then we can get feedback on both of those pieces. Just Sarah, would you be able to, under question 2, that first paragraph before 2.1, if you can just add some space there. Then we're gonna take question 2.6 at the bottom. We're gonna move that up. Up.
Make it 2.1.
Yeah.
You can probably take off the overarching goal now, since we put that above.
Oh. Yeah. Put that on the slide.
Either way, that's fine.
Yeah, I'm gonna do 2.2, and then Josh's suggestion was for 2.2, other goals for growing crossings on fish bearing streams. Oh, sorry, you were right there. Sorry.
She just renumbered.
Oh, okay.
She'll get back up. Whenever she gets.
2.2, my suggestion was just to drop the fish bearing. If anything, we need to focus that on goal 3 rather than check 3.1. And so be it, but especially for these two guys, the non-fish network contributions, right?
Yeah, I would strongly agree with that. I would support. Yeah.
I had mine now for a while.
Did
like-
we, goals still in there somewhere?
Oh, you're right, I see.
It's on the
Someone else.
slide.
Thank you. Yep.
Oh, I see, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Good catch.
And
Thanks.
then Sarah will bring it back over, bring it over to the doc.
Thanks.
Thanks for.
Got it, Wendy.
I think it was including the overarching. So you
Why
want
am I losing it here? Da-da-da.
Come on.
There we go, okay.
including
Thank
the,
you. Okay, thanks. Alright.
Sorry.
Okay,
It's
and then
okay.
we were talking about, okay.
Sure.
So. My question, so I agree with the monitoring piece, on the persistence, I think that that's good to bring that up. For all of the other ones, the new 2.2 through 2.6, I agree with Josh that they're the why, like if something's going wrong, then these are answering the why, kind of in the effectiveness monitoring of the rules. I am wondering if we're putting the cart before the horse, in that if we are doing monitoring and everything looks good, then we can reasonably assume that the rules are working. Why would we be going and measuring all these other pieces other than, like, before we haven't collectively gotten to a place where we are in agreement on an effectiveness monitoring plan. Wouldn't these BGOs be included in the effectiveness monitoring plan? And I guess I feel like we're straying pretty far into a completely different research question, and set of research questions at this point.
I think just to reflect back on the first conversation of this, we built that list as a way to, because the original question was something like, how does implementation of forest practices rules affect habitat and persistence? Which I think we all agree that was too much to look at. And in fact, between the report, I don't have it in front of me, but I think there's language in there about, you know, looking at steep slopes and some other components that it would make sense to hone in on particular sections of rule or areas most likely to be impacted. Which is why, if I'm remembering right, that we pulled those out specifically. So I think they are related. The question to the broader sort of habitat persistence question sets that up, but then we provide, in my mind, the policy direction to say these are those places where we're most interested, rather than being separate.
Yeah, better understand how riparian and unstable slope protections. Impact persistence. It's really an impact persistence of populations. There is nothing about it. In the report itself. So I see where we're going. I guess the way that these are worded, I'm just concerned that they're worded in a way that already has an implicit bias on something's wrong.
I see what you're saying. I mean, it could say things like, how do amphibians use the habitat that's created for fish function? I mean, you could word it a different way, right? You could be measuring very similar things. But
I think the way that we go, I think the way that we go from science policy though is to say rules. And that's, you know, we're not here to just like hang out, we are here to say like, you know, to ask the question, right? That leads us towards something, and it can lead us towards saying that the rule is benefiting the species because this is a rule that the results of following the rule are that torrent salamanders are persisting over time. It doesn't, I mean, we in the work group, but then I recall that in the last meeting where we worked on this as a full group, we were careful to say impact and not harm. I think that we've done a sufficient job of laying aside value judgments about how the rules are affecting them. I mean, because it says impact, right? We know that the things that we do are changing them. We don't know though which way.
Anyone online? Sorry, I can't see you, so. So I think that.
Jason looks like he might have something to say.
I was just gonna say no comments here. I heard someone say you can't see us, so I just thought I'd just pipe up.
I think, I mean, maybe there is a conversation to be had about prioritizing these, which I think is where Terry was taking us. But I guess just reflecting back a little bit of how we got here, which was that we were trying to narrow that a little bit to provide that policy direction. And I guess my read of that language worked on by the work group is that it does try to make that connection without that value judgment of one way or the other, but it's, you know, we want to consider there's an alternative you want to propose. I think that it gets us pretty close here though.
I think, I don't know where for the 2.2, this, you know, the stream crossings. I can't remember if that's in the road rules or not. I would say that if we need to focus, we should focus on riparian rules and unstable slope rules, because that's what the EFA called out. So I would probably remove the one that focuses on road rules, because that's not what the intention was to focus on. I'd probably keep the other ones, and you know, I think it's fine, I guess, to say impact. I still think there's a scientific bias that impact typically means harm, whether this entire group agrees or not. Saying impact versus saying benefit is very different.
Say effect. Effect is nice, is a neutral term.
Yeah.
I mean, it says, yeah, fair, fair.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an issue with saying effect.
And I guess, and then the second part of my comment is that, and I understand kind of what the work group has said, and what Terry said, but I am not gonna be at a point of voting on this if we do not get more specific in the questions that we outline. Saying, how do rules, period, affect these species gives me a lot of pause. You know, I think that we should be directing the research to answer specific questions around which rules are we really talking about.
That was a comment that I had as well, that stuck out to me. I understand sort of where the work group was coming from, but I do think that being a little more specific with what exactly the rule set we're talking about would strengthen, although
Well,
there's a little.
to get safe forest practices, but that might not go over well.
To that end, I mean, I could propose, I'd be willing to propose something to help us move along in this discussion, and that is, there's nothing, what we have to do now is we have to put forward a package for amphibians that will satisfy the initial entry into this topic and move us along. And I think we have more than enough of question 1 and the new 2.1, or question 2, you can just call it. That would more than satisfy the budget that we have, move us in the direction, and we can table the rest of these questions for future conversations. That is one way to handle this. We could even do it not in a way that we table forever. We could just say, can we vote on question 1 and question 2 and get support, and then leave these other ones to a future meeting. Maybe it's not 10 years down the road, maybe it's 6 months, 4 months down the road. And we still have the conversation you're talking about having when we try to specify some of these other things. I'm more comfortable than it sounds like you are, just going at generalities and sort of prioritizing a list. But I don't think we should necessarily die on that hill if we've got 2 questions that we're getting general consensus around, and that's more than enough to move us in the direction that we need to go for the time being. Maybe that makes more sense just to bite that off and move forward.
So something that Amanda said that I thought was very on point, because I've been on that work group, is effectiveness monitoring. And the effectiveness monitoring is supposed to look directly at, are the rules effective for protecting or generating habitat for the persistence of the species, right? And 2.2 through 6 are effectiveness questions on amphibian persistence, specific to the current salamanders, the non-fish stream network. So to Seth's point, do we want to move question 1 and question 2.1 along? And then, because we're going to want to ask probably very similar questions to 2.2 and 2.6 on the covered fish species as well, when we're designing our effectiveness monitoring program. which we have to do, right? We need to have that in place to get the HCP approved and to receive that incidental take permit. So, like I said, I really think that I'm totally comfortable with 2.2 through 2.6 because I think those are really good effectiveness monitoring questions that relate to the torrent salamanders. And obviously, as soon as we had an IRST, I was like, great, let's tackle effectiveness monitoring. I got told to wait, and then I got told to move forward, which I'm happy both ways. Anyway, so I'm comfortable personally with Seth's suggestion to move along question 1, make question 2.1 into question 2, and then take 2.2 and 2.6 and dump them into the effectiveness monitoring work groups lab and make us work on that. And when we hear back from IRST, and probably we're going to need to frame up similar questions that will probably mimic a lot of that for the fish species as well. I think if looking at that if I was trying to come up with how to do effectiveness monitoring questions for the covered fish species, I would probably copy as much of this torrent salamander stuff as possible, because I think it hits each rule set, right? Crossings on the road network, no harvest RMAs, type N rules, steep slope rules. I mean, that's all the big pieces, right? So we're gonna have to answer the same questions for fish. So I would be okay with kind of checking off the amphibian box using question 1, question 2, and moving the others to the effectiveness monitor discussion.
Alternatively. Thank you. In looking, I've been in the habit, thanks to maybe reminding myself in the town report what the language is. And I think there's a way to do that. I think there's a way to have question 1 and question 2, and then include some of these quote impact questions or effect questions. We'll say impact because that's what it says in the final report. As hey, be thinking about these. You've done a lot of parentheticals. Hey, be thinking about these, and then be thinking about them as the riparian and the unstable slope protections. And actually, it says protections. It's like the riparian and unstable slope protections for the persistence, the impact of the persistence of populations. And to me, it really, to your question of like, I think it's about harm. It actually sounds kind of like these things are protecting the species. But so a way to get to Josh's proposal, which is kind of your proposal, but a little bit more specific, is to have question 1 and then have question 2, which essentially sets up that comprehensive monitoring program, but to highlight that the comprehensive monitoring program needs to help us better understand riparian and unstable slope protections and how they impact the species, the persistence rate of the species. And so that's because of the next sentence there, which says that the authors agree that the 1.5 million will be used to fund initial study, and that ongoing research over appropriate intervals of time beyond this initial study will be necessary to understand research outcomes over a long period of time. So that's really the idea of setting it up and then having research questions that get plugged into this monitoring. That's the reference to a parenthetical statement that's like, we'd like to make sure that this program is able to look at riparian and unstable slope protections. Does that make sense?
So in other words, what you're suggesting is that a long-term monitoring of looking at Columbia and Southern Torrens would be, you'd put sites out there specifically in mind where you would be able to tease out variables from the slopes protections and the
like at a minimum,
and the other protections at some point to answer the question of effectiveness.
Yeah.
That's essentially what you're saying. So you sprinkle these out in enough places, so maybe you even highlight there's steep ground in this area where we have polygons, for slopes.
Yeah.
So we're gonna make sure X amount of sites are located in X amount of proximity for these rules, so that we can then tease out the effect of those rules on the species.
Essentially, it's saying question 2 is like, hey, by the way, we're gonna ask you all these other questions, and please be set up to do them. Or all of these, maybe not all of them.
I appreciate that, Casey, that framing, and I think for my benefit, I don't know, I really think the inclusion of the language around, you know, looking at the protections and how are, with that wording from the report, you know, how are these rule changes protecting the species and, you know, these protections impacting the species. To me, that's a little bit of a different framing of it, because now it's saying, hey, all of us, you know, and all of the authors agree that we all agreed that this was enough, that this is what we wanted to do. You know, people gave concessions, this is where we negotiated to, the federal services agree, we're going towards this take permit. So framing it as though, you know, these are protections and the intent of the change was to provide more, more protection and more, I don't want to keep using the same word, but more benefit for the species. And let's measure that, right? Let's measure that, let's monitor that. And if we see a blip and something is happening that's unexpected because the species is not improving, that's where, you know, my thoughts around having all those other things included in the baseline is important. So then we can tease out, okay, if the expectation is that the species do better because we're added protections, and they're not, let's figure out, is it, you know, is it because of the activities, or is the effectiveness piece not there? Is it a health issue? Is there something that is now happening to the species that we didn't know? Is there more predation now because of, you know, opening up stream reaches to fish or whatever it is, right? I think that framing helps me feel a lot more comfortable with where we're headed.
We have, oh,
Looks like both
Sorry.
guys.
Or
Wendy.
Wendy was up.
Yeah, I'm trying to absorb, thanks, that's, trying to be a good listener, remember what you said, well, I'm trying to remember my idea. But I think my thought is somewhat consistent with yours, which is thinking about, I sort of feel partly like a lot of good work's been done in developing these questions, but I also see the point at maybe queuing up a two-phase thing where we have initially the two initial questions, and then we go to more specific questions that are more effectiveness related over time. But I would tend to myself to leave those later questions in there and simply put in some kind of introduction that could even refer to 7.3.4 of the report, which does specifically say that we're supposed to be doing an initial study. And then linking that over time into the effectiveness monitoring program, directed to do that. So to me, it's a little bit like showing we're doing the homework and thinking forward, and also capturing all the work that was done by the working group and by us today. So I propose doing some sort of way of having the first two questions and then having sort of some preface, maybe referring to the Accord report that then lines up these following questions.
Just one quick response, maybe. I wonder if our question 1 identifies that initial study of like the baseline, right? Because it's getting to trying to answer the questions around, well, what even is habitat, right? Where do these things actually exist?
Especially with all the variables we're suggesting they also measure.
So it seems like in an entire package of questions that we're providing, we are getting that initial study plus the monitoring on these two species that's outlined in the report.
Sure, I've thought of it as setting up initially the broad species baseline that we're gonna need for the broader effectiveness issues. And then the following ones, which we are now restricting to the two species of salamanders, having that sort of linking into the reference to 1.5 million for the initial study. That's, to me, that kind of logically falls together, that this committee has made the decision, okay, because we're going to be looking at baseline, it's kind of practical. like they're saying, like to look at a number of species, but then have a second set of questions linked directly into those two species and linking to that initial study that's funded.
Sorry, my comment is just in response to Casey as I thought about this, as I've been thinking about this. Just in the last few minutes since you suggested it, and sort of me trying to articulate what I think you were saying. What my concern would be, like, I think it's a risk of kind of Josh's point, trying to tell the scientists how to do their science jobs. In that if we load up too many, because if we ask the question, we try to embed within the question of a baseline or even persistence of a species over time, some questions of, hey, we're also going to be looking at slopes, we're also going to be looking at these other things. That will then lead to, because if I'm a scientist, that's going to lead me to put more sites, more measuring spots in certain locations so I can answer those other questions, which may pull away from my ability to say anything broad about the species as a whole, because now I have more of my sites are heavier to this type of environment versus the entire, so if I harken back to my compliance monitoring days prior to this Mount Hood Environmental going through and I know there's enough of you guys doing compliance monitoring that I know you know what I'm talking about, most of you. But prior to that, they were trying to infer statewide compliance without, and they were trying to also hone in on specific sites. And one of the critiques mounted environment.
Uh-oh.
That wasn't good.
No.
We lost the main part of the show.
Right. Let's see here. I'm gonna see if I can get them.
We can see him now, just can't hear him.
We might have got cut off.
Oh, there we go.
There they
Yes.
are.
Nice job.
Sorry.
Sorry.
So I'll try not to go back too far, but in a sense, if you get too many sites in one specific type of, so say it's steep slopes and you're looking at amphibians, then you're overloading your sample in that area and therefore biasing your overall population response to one particular type of characteristic. You know what I'm saying? So I'm trying to articulate that I'm not on its face, I'm not like against the idea of like what you're proposing, Casey, that is to say, as you're doing this, as you're setting this up, think about the fact that we're also going to be asking these other questions going forward. At the same time, I don't want to force them into a situation where we're telling them how to do their job in a way that we don't quite fully understand the ramifications of what that might bias or, make difficult for them. I almost think maybe that would also be something that we could add to the list of discussion points with them. That is to say, we go with question 1, question 2, and then we go in with a question and a dialogue with them, saying, hey, we've got these other things that they have steep slopes, we have riparian, we have crossings. Is there a way to set up question 2 that helps you prepare for answering questions 2. All the rest of these, rather than embedding that implicitly into question 2 as it is. Anyway, I know that's a long worded, hopefully I made sense.
Amanda, and then I want us to take a second to try to add some text, because I'm hearing a lot of good ideas. I don't feel super clear on what the change, if there is a change to 2 that needs to happen.
And Sarah, those of us in Zoom land are just, we're not seeing any screen share. So somehow when the Wi-Fi cut out, it stopped sharing the screen.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
That's all right.
Is everybody back in the online? Is everybody able to get back online, or was it just us that cut out?
It was just you that cut out. We all said, hey, what happened?
Oh, weird.
Yeah, I got a message popped up that said Wi-Fi, we lost Wi-Fi on here, so.
I think we're
The Wi-Fi was like, Seth is talking again.
I'm pretty sure that was some of Seth's best stuff too that we missed.
The camera is also pointed up. It's somehow changed. So that we're not seeing the folks closer in the foreground.
Oh, yeah.
You can see that drop
There you
ceiling.
go.
There you go.
Okay, so Amanda, and then let's take a second to tweak this language, because I feel a little bit lost on what the proposal is.
Well, I'm not gonna help you. I guess my follow-up to what Seth said, which I thought was really good, is if the monitoring, like the way, the methodology associated with the monitoring question that we have, the 2.1, is such that there's enough diversity of sites and there's enough, the sample size is large enough in different places, then at what point do we, as a group, adaptive management program, go back to IRST or the researchers to identify questions, research questions that utilize the data collected in the monitoring? Like, how does that work? Because it almost seems like some of these questions could be answered through the data that's collected, but we don't need to identify those questions up front, right? Or do, like, I'm not really
That's a
sure.
great question,
how
I
that
feel
works.
like, maybe we need to.
Yeah, because that's what you're saying is like, don't preload those questions because they don't want to skew the methodology and the setup of where they select their plots and the different stream reaches and stuff. But if we're gonna ask a question in the future related to that monitoring, should
Yeah.
they know that? Or-
Well, and
Like,
that's,
I don't
and that
know.
was what I was saying in terms of maybe we should have that dialogue.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I just think like, just again, to take a step back, these are our questions that we send to the IRST. They're not like the research, it's,
Yeah.
there's still more steps that will further define what the research is. You raise a great point, both of you, around sort of the process, how that works, how we're developing these questions. I don't think we're gonna resolve that right now, but that would be a great one to raise with the IRST. I would, want their perspective on that. But I do want to bring us back to question 2, Casey.
Yeah, just to bringing it back to question 2, I mean, it's obviously the final report, thank you for writing it, has a lot of information that has directed us, and it's proven to be useful at times in directing us when we have questions. And forgive me for until this point not having read and retained all of it. But I will just note that if we wanted to just be done right now, we could take out questions 2.2 through 2.5 or whatever it is. And really highlight, what is this? We could highlight the things in the PFA final report that are required or that are questions of the impact. Right, impacting the population and persistence of the species. Because it feels like if we are just going to establish a monitoring program, we're not really doing the PFA final report's direction, and we could probably do whatever we want. But if we're going to use the final report to direct us, then we should probably use it to direct us. And it has some specifics. And I say that like additional conservation measures to conserve stream dwelling or amphibians include, and it's suggesting that we like look at those, right? The slope retention areas, the designated debris flow dispersal areas, stream adjacent failure prescriptions that are identified in chapter 3. So there are things here that we can identify. And then further down, it says, hey, when you're studying your study, please look at stream adjacent failures, or sorry, unstable slopes. And riparian, how riparian unstable slope protections impact persistence of populations.
Most of what, just real quick, most of what you're saying, Casey, is actually in the very document you're looking at. It's further down.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you for that flag.
That way people can look at it too.
It's on page 6 of the draft. And so that's all to just say that, if we're gonna send something to IRST, it's just questions 1 and 2, and 2 being question 2.1. We're missing a big part of it. We're missing a big part of what the final report at least directs us to do.
Yeah,
And if we need more specifics there, we can use the report rather than the questions that are there. Sorry.
no, I think that's where we're headed. I want to spend a little time because I'm hearing a lot of let's add this to 2. And I think that's sort of what you're getting at, Casey, and I want to like take the time to see if we can get that right. So maybe Sarah, in the Word document, would you mind, I'm so sorry, to read under the 2.1, if you could just add a bunch of spaces there, 'cause I think that's what we're talking about. For question 2 would be that first paragraph with Wendy's edit of including that overarching goal. Then the 2.1 question around what is the persistence of salamanders over landscape. And then I think I've been hearing there needs to be an addition, maybe it's a sub bullet or an additional part of 2.1 that somehow reflects the direction in the report around understanding how steep slopes and riparian rules affect the persistence and habitat of those horned salamanders.
Yeah.
Is that what I'm hearing? That we want to include, we're interested in the persistence of these species across the landscape. And monitoring, we want to do that. And then there's also a further, we're most interested in, or we would want to start looking at those specific rule sections identified in the report.
Jason has his hand up as well.
Oh, sorry, Jason, I can't see you.
No problem. I was just looking at the steep slopes and I can't remember, Casey, Seth, we talked about steep slopes and I thought we had some specific language that we kind of worked around for that provision. Am I remembering correctly? Terry, you might remember as well. I think we pulled it directly out of the language.
I think
Yeah, it's 2.6 now. How do rules for steep, unstable slope protections impact Columbia and southern torrent salamanders habitat?
And maybe that's just rephrased as how do rules for steep and unstable slope protections impact Columbia and southern torrent salamanders persistence? Just to tie it in.
The report talks about current and proposed rules for private forest land. So.
I think it's because they were current at the time.
Right, and it says, it says, you bring up a good point, Casey. It says the funding cycle for the government program to better understand how riparian and unstable slope protections of at least the current and proposed rules. So talking about what is now the old rules and the new rules for private forest land impact persistence of the population. The other way you could read that is there were already rules in place for slope protections, all the HLHL rules. That could be interpreted as the quote unquote current under what this was saying, and the proposed would then be the new ones.
I propose some language for that sub bullet, just again on that effort to try to synthesize what I think I'm hearing. Which is, how do the steep slopes and riparian rules affect the persistence?
Effect or effect?
Effect, I think, of this.
Effect.
Can we say protect?
Of any.
Open protections, and then I think it's impact.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Sarah, the lead to riparian.
Sorry, Chair.
I think the amended proposal is protections. Impact. The persistence. And habitat, I guess that is what I would toss in there, but of Columbia and Southern Torrent salamanders. And maybe that needs a little bit of framing, as in, you know, this is sort of what we are most interested in, but is that sort of the heart of the question there, that we're trying to pull out the direction from the report, not, I guess, reactions?
I'm just looking, I just pulled up the document on my own computer and I'm looking at some of the notes and in the like other information section, the section B.5 of the package. We've got a lot of information in there, and like this obviously needs to be massaged and cleaned up before we have a final rule package to vote on. And we have some of this, I mean, it's not that surprising that we reiterate our points from the last meeting, especially since our last one was like the beginning of December. So a lot of this was already in here, but I'm wondering if this piece should be in the other information piece, because I would rather have the actual question be focused on kind of that monitoring, persistence, landscape, and then the other information that we say is like, oh, by the way, IRST, in developing your request for proposal, please indicate to folks that are gonna be developing a proposal that the sample design needs to be such that there's enough sites that could answer a question like this. And they would have to grapple with how they incorporate that into the RFP for a researcher to then respond to.
Yeah, and that was kind of Casey's original.
Yeah.
problem.
They take it back, so.
Yeah, I guess my point is, rather than including it in the question, but we're still including it in the intent is that it gets included in the research. But we want this question around persistence to be about more than just steep slopes and riparian. The report just simply says that those are the things that we should focus on first, but it doesn't say they're the only things in perpetuity that we should ever care about.
Yeah.
So anyways,
My concern with all of this is that we're gonna still have to prioritize all. And we're gonna have to figure out what are the priorities, because there's so much, we're biting off that it's gonna be too much for. I mean. We only have so many resources, and we're gonna have to figure out how to balance it. But maybe that's a question for another day, and we just move forward with questions and prioritize later. I don't know.
I'm spending all this, sorry. Just spending a lot of time on this. I know we have other things on the agenda, but my hope was really to see if we could get pretty close to a place where we would be able to vote on something, and acknowledging the package fully still needs work. But can we get the actual questions in a place where maybe at our next meeting, maybe today, if we're really getting close, that we can move forward on that. So I appreciate everyone's stamina to keep working through this, but I think it will be well worth it to keep moving forward on these. I guess maybe to your point of how do we sort of advance this, there's been really good work done on the additional questions. I certainly want to see a number of these included, but it may not be at this stage. So do we feel like question 2, as it stands, 2.1, what is the persistence? Is that enough to move forward, or are we still missing something?
I need folks. Oh, you directed that to Seth, so.
Oh, no, that was a general question.
Cool, that's great. When we were working in a smaller group on this, question 2.1 now was never intended to stand on its own. So question 2.1 needs detail in order for anybody to really know what you're asking. I mean, and really I say that from the perspective of, you look at it, you're like, what is that question? And so the purpose of originally was, we have these call outs for different rule sets and how they impact these two particular species of salamander. And then at the bottom, the ultimate, like the kind of ultimate question, which has now been placed in a priority location, which wasn't my intent at least, and I don't think it was the intent of the people in the work group. That question was really about, okay, so all of these things being said, is this species persisting on the landscape? Or these two species? So to me, to your question, I think that if we're gonna keep 2.1, we at the very least need to have what is now the sub bullet pointed question, which I actually don't really think is a sub.
No, it's question 3. I was gonna suggest that you have a question 1, a question 2, and a question 3. Basically. The sub bullet there is its own question.
And if we get a clarifying question, sorry, if we get a clarifying question of, well, what are the protections? I mean, RST, they know where to find all the rules, and so does Sean, but we can also pull them out too. But they're highly capable, I know, they're incredibly competent people.
Yeah, they are competent, very competent. Most of them don't have a whole lot of experience with the forest practices rules.
And they've specifically said, well, which rules are you talking about? So whether AMC finds the specific rules or you delegate the subject matter experts at ODF and then maybe review what they pull out as relevant to each of these questions. The IRST has kind of like you said, Seth, IRST has said, you know, you guys need to tell us which rules.
I think Sarah could delete that bullet and just make that. Sorry, keep the text. Delete that.
Yeah, so now I have a question. Are we then just putting 3 and deleting all the specific, is the proposal to delete all the specific bullets below, like up to 2.5 or 6? Because I was thinking I would like to keep the specific questions, but just have an introduction, I think I mentioned this before, have an introductory section that refers to the board report and just quotes what it says in there about what we're supposed to do, which is do an initial study that focuses on these two species of salamanders. And then I would propose keeping the questions below. We could put in the introductory bit, the quote, the language of the report, which talks about steep slopes and riparian, I believe. And then below, just put the bullets and say something like, we anticipate this will involve looking at the following questions, like subject to your scientific judgment or something like that. I keep thinking that taking out the work we've done and providing some specifics is sort of a loss of effort, and that eventually the IRSD is going to need some direction from us anyway.
So I was just thinking that the addition of 3 and not making it part of 2, where it's persistence and persistence. One is persistence based upon just what's happening in their overall environment. The second one is now their persistence based upon these 2 things, steep slopes and so I'm not sure I want to make it a separate 3. I think it should be part of 2. And I agree with your comments about.
Yeah, I think that question 3 should be the new 2.2. And it should include, road crossings, because for species being able to move through their habitat and mingle, depopulate an area if it gets depopulated for some reason. That ability to move is very important. And roads are probably the biggest barrier that there is for a lot of species. And the way the natural disturbance regime works, and with salmon and with amphibians is that, natural disasters do wipe out localized populations, and it's the ability to move that then so you have populations like, think of them as lights on the landscape will be areas that are lit and a light goes out, and then, things migrate in there and the light comes back on. And that's why about 10% of salmon are wanderers, because if population gets wiped out in, say, a 6-field watershed by like a giant landslide or an intense fire, all the wanderers from neighboring areas will wander on in and repopulate it. And because all those then landslides happen and there's gravel everywhere, they'll do quite well for the one. So, populations we're not looking for individual small area populations to always persist. We're looking for the meta population to persist and be healthy. And so that requires connectivity. And so I think we do on question 3, which I agree with Will, should really kind of go as the other part, like to question 2.1. It needs to include like the bird crossing rules, because that's so important to the connectivity.
And as it says in the final report, the reduction of fine sediment through the hydrologic disconnection too, so for the connect road crossing.
Yes, fines as well. Yeah.
So that's the really small scale, not your like whole sections of looking at.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm,
Spacing's not there.
Well, I'm just wondering, I was really hopeful that maybe we
Yeah.
could get this in a tighter space, but I don't think we're gonna quite get there, although I think there's been some really good conversation on this one, and I'm wondering if this is pick question 2 to the work group to refine, or if we wanna consider, I think your proposal that I was some consensus around, which is basically taking that question 3 and bumping it. So it's not its own question, but that it's sort of like, I don't know how you should describe that, Wendy, that's information, additional information for IST.
I was thinking of framing it with a preface that relates to the part of the core report on adaptive management. And then saying that these are questions we have identified and that relate to what the Accord's asking us to do, which is to do this initial study, including riparian and stable slope protections, and then saying these are questions we have identified, which we expect to follow our question above, and put something general like we expect to work with you on these in the future.
I think something like that could make sense. I mean, what I fear here is that, again, and I don't disagree with you, Josh, you could add in roads there, and I think that fits just fine. What I see down the road is we're just gonna still have to prioritize, because we're basically just rewriting everything that was below and putting it back in.
Yes.
And it's still a 50-year plan. You know what I mean? So they're gonna say, well, you can't have everything. What do you really? And so we're gonna be back around this table going, okay, now where do we go? So I'm not trying to throw a wet blanket on anything. I agree with what you're saying, Casey, that there is that. So maybe the report does say that we focus on those areas. I appreciate you bringing that in, and maybe these suggesting as a way to sort of tackle that without shackling too much that it can't be moved forward. I don't know. I mean, the other way to move forward is we just, like you said, we move it to a work group to try to hone in on question 2 and ultimately end up giving plate that's too big to the IRST, and then forces us into having a further discussion once we have more information from them.
Yeah, I think I'm leaning towards bumping this back to a work group and maybe it's a different one and maybe I will volunteer Wendy to be part of that. So
Sure.
you can help. I like your idea. I don't think we can quite wordsmith it as a group right now.
Better write down what my idea is.
Forget it. To continue to flesh out question 2 and consider ways that we can share the work that has been done, show that we've been thinking about these questions, but also recognize that there's a prioritization that needs to happen of resources and focus that we're trying to identify. Other volunteers for a question 2 amphibians work group?
Are you, so this is gonna have, sorry, direction from the full EMC. Cause I'm just saying that, cause like we thought we had direction. And then we came here and it was clear we didn't, our interpretation of the direction was different than what folks at the table thought was the direction. And so I wanna make sure that this work group then has the direction necessary to produce something that's ready for the next go round. Cause as it is, if I was in the work group, I would have no idea about how to get us from what's there on the screen to something that everybody's gonna agree to.
Yes.
Maybe we can get input, oh, sorry, for you next. Maybe we get an interim input from the group before our next big meeting.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I feel like we have gone full circle, like we often tend to do. And we're just back at the same place where that 2.2 question talks about rules and protections without defining them. So, I mean, it seems like at this point, and I'll volunteer myself, but that if we develop a work group to figure that out, then the goal of that work group is actually to pull out and tease out which rules we're talking about. Because I think that until we actually do that, there's gonna be disagreement amongst the group of what specific riparian and unstable slope protections we're talking about that are related to, or we feel like need to be researched around persistence.
So
Jason has his hand raised.
yeah, real quick on that, and Terry, correct me if I'm wrong, but we kind of talked about, we had, to Casey's point, we thought we were coming back with a little clearer direction, but we talked about the rule set and how it applies back here. And I think what our discussion was is that we want to kind of generally address the question, but maybe we need some additional support from ODF and folks to really narrow down what those rules look like. So I don't know if the subgroup is the appropriate place to do that, or I'm going to look to Terry and see, do we need to bring in some additional support at this point on the rule set side?
Yeah, I definitely suggest bringing in additional ODF support, and that doesn't remove the AMPC from making a final decision, but I think they're going to be able to do a pretty, since their bread and butter are writing and interpreting the rules, folks like Greg Erb and whatnot, they're going to be able to say, yes, this does fit into that slot, this doesn't. And then if you folks see additional things or have different perspectives, that by all means those can be considered. But yeah.
So Terry, would you suggest maybe?
Well, I think if you're really talking about what's now 2.2 with steep slopes, riparian protections, I can talk to the right people about the specific rules and kind of come up with that list, and then I could certainly sit down with a work group to review those. That's probably what makes the most sense to me. I'm open to ideas.
That sounds fine. Wendy, is that what you had in mind?
I am,
Thought you
I'm good with that. But I was, because I basically liked the work group draft, like 90% of it, so I was pretty happy and you guys did a really good job. I was thinking more my approach would be to stick with more of that rather than sort of doing a deeper dive, asking questions about what rules should be looked at. So I was thinking of a more streamlined process, but what people agree on, I'm still happy to be part of the working group.
Yeah, I thought we were a lot closer on two as well.
Okay, yeah.
So, but also understanding the questions around effectiveness monitoring and pulling that out and which rules are really looking at, I think maybe we weren't as ready as thought we were.
I don't know, to me, like the idea of going, getting staff support is appealing on some level, but it's also, to me, like going into the territory that I would think the IRST would be coming back and providing some input on.
Sure. And I have a comment too. If that's cool. Okay, so if ODS staff are going to come back with a set of rules and they're gonna come back, they're not gonna come back, they're gonna go to a work group with a set of rules. Some of the questions for the work group that I'm trying to key you into, whoever is gonna do it, is are small forest land owners rules gonna be something you're gonna consider? Because obviously they're a riparian rule. And the other question is it just on the west side? Is it only within the habitat? Or is it all steep slopes rules and all riparian rules? So do you see what I mean? There's like, are you going to constrain them to a set of questions, or are you gonna say that all are open? The next kind of like question that I would have is, are you going to look at rules that changed? Like, are they just the new rules, or are they old rules plus new rules, or are they just the old rules? And that's a question around that is, I don't actually know which ones are fully changed or just different. And there's like, I don't know the answer to those, so hopefully other people do. Like I'm looking at one, 629, 643, 0200, placing large wood key pieces in type F or type SSBT streams. Like, I don't know if that one's new. It's in my rules revisions document, so I assume it's new. But it's not part of the like riparian expansion plus steep slopes plus roads. So that's all, that's my next question.
Yeah, and my answer to that would be, we're gonna have to get ODF to help us with that list of rules.
Well, I think that this is a question for us to answer, is do SFs, for example, like are we asking specifically, do small forest land owner protection riparian rules, which are different? You know, like that's a question that we're gonna answer, not like, obviously it's a riparian rule, so ODF will include it. But unless we give direction to them, we're not gonna know, is this are we looking at new rules, old rules, SFs, east side, west side? And this was part of, I think, part of, you know, our thing with Jason. We were like, well, we'd like them to look at these rules. We didn't get into the rules because we thought it would be important for IRST to be involved. Sorry, I'm down.
There's like cracks, I guess, here, or like an obstacle for us not being able to move forward on a version of 2 is that we don't have a shared understanding of what, when we say steep slopes and riparian rules, what we're talking about. Is that, because I'm just concerned.
Oh, yeah, so my question is really just like, how does the work group know to bring back a product that we're gonna be ready to move forward with? That's really the question. Does that make sense?
Yes, so I'm just trying to, if we're gonna ask ODF to pull out rules to answer a question, is that sort of a sticking point that's preventing us from being able to, that we have different understanding of what steep slopes and riparian rules mean in this context?
Well, it sounds like there was going to be within the work group, like a work group of discussion of which rules were applicable. I just thought it would be good for them to, rather than coming back and having the whole group be like, well, that's actually not what we're thinking. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I just want to preload
I'm just
it
trying to
in their success.
Yeah.
So if I may jump in, because
Yeah.
my biggest sticking point to moving forward with it is this, I don't believe that what that those three questions are questions that they can tackle all at once. I don't think, and so I think we're kind of putting forward something that we're just gonna have to bring back. And so I would rather us do the hard work to prioritize and give them something that we think is a reasonable chunk to bite off with the time and funding in the first iteration, rather than, just handing them something that's just gonna boomerang back to us with a question of what's the priority? It's because there's too much here. So that's my biggest concern with putting it forward, not necessarily that, but I understand that Amanda's got a bigger concern with wanting to understand what rules we're talking about. So, and I could, but just to answer your
Just wanna
question.
make sure I'm.
Yeah,
That's
clear.
my
I
biggest-
think there's roadblocks and that they're not totally clear to me what they are.
Yes,
So I'm just trying to daylight where we're getting stuck, and I think that is one of them. So relying on ODF staff to support that and form the work groups, so we're all looking at the same thing, this is what we're talking about, will help us then. Amanda? Oh, Amanda then will.
Yeah, I will say that I was closer to a point of feeling good when I think Josh had brought up the concept of, a lot of these questions could be associated with the effectiveness monitoring plan that we develop, and that's sort of that identification of the different rules, going through that comprehensively. And again, like I'm okay the direction that we're going, but in some ways it's sort of gonna be a rehash when we get to that point of effectiveness monitoring. We make a decision now that is not necessarily aligned with the future conversation we have around how the effectiveness monitoring is set up. I don't know the answer to that question, obviously that's not yet, so just wanna like put a marker down that this is a challenging environment because we want to be consistent with what we're directed to do in the PFA report, which has focused on riparian and steep slopes. But at the same time, like I feel like to do that, we have to identify what the specific practices are that we're talking about, right? And so it's like I have a hard time in my brain like figuring out those two things. And I think it'd be easier if we already had the effectiveness monitoring plan and that work done, but we don't. It would have been delayed on the BGOs and the HCP stuff. So that's where I think I'm struggling, is that if we would already have that, then we could augur into that, but we don't, so we can't. So it's just that I just want to explain the challenge that I'm having.
That's super helpful. Well, Wendy,
Before we go off into another subgroup, and I do think we're gonna come back to this a couple more times. Seth's comment a minute ago caused me to say, what if we just move forward with question 1 and question 2, just with the question? And cause us to move and start getting some data and getting the literature reviews and start getting some material, some feedback. Then, because I think that all these questions and more are gonna come up as we get more information. And I don't think we can perceive half of the questions when we don't know the persistence today. We don't know the population. We don't know the density. We really don't know that yet. And until we do, again, looking at just the 2 salamanders, when I think about that, until we do, we're spinning our tires down. So I would propose we move 1 and 2 as move forward with other questions.
I'd like to move forward on 1 and 2.
I was gonna say, I like the idea of going forward with 1 and 2, and I feel partly what you said could be, again, I keep finding that keeping our question, putting a preface, like, for right now, we're asking you to do 1 and 2, but realizing that the Accord directs us to do this stuff over time and develop effectiveness monitoring. So we list this additional stuff below for working on in the future. Because I do think that to a certain extent, including that second part, just matches what we've been asked to do. We're both asked to do a broad question amphibians, and they're asked to do stuff under the report, which includes questions about the 2 species.
The only thing I was gonna add, and I fully support where you guys are at, I think that does move us along in a constructive way. The report itself, as I look at it, does say, it talks about the unstable slope protections and riparian, it does say, to support this program, it is recommended. Most of the PFA report doesn't use the words recommended. It talks about, you know, this is what we agreed to do. In this section, it does say it is recommended that you'll spend $1.5 million, and you'll look at these things first. And I'm not downplaying, I'm really trying not to say that that's just crap, they didn't know what they were talking about. I understand this was an agreement, and I'm fully supportive of it. But in the context of where we're at right now and the understanding of trying to move forward with limited resources and everything we have, I think moving in this direction and doing as you suggest, Wendy, outlining these things are our priorities, and we will, these are on the list. Does move us in the spirit of what the agreement was, and I think it's constructive.
So I wanna do a quick temperature check
I
on
just,
that.
well, so I struggle with number 2 because I don't know what it means, and maybe other people know what it means. So that's all. If other people understand it enough to be able to explain it to RST in a way that they can make a research question, I just don't know what it means. Because do other people know?
2.1, I think is. what
Oh,
we're
yeah,
looking at, right?
2.1, yeah.
Okay.
To me, that's a question that is a sub, like, right, that, to me, it's all about the relationship between forest management and the covered species. So it's the relationship, right? Whereas the first one is, well, where are they? And so if other people understand question 2.1 to be, this is the relationship between forest management, and I'm just looking at the language of the private forest code report, then I'm fine with just setting aside other concerns, but I don't understand it right now.
And my unscientific layperson interpretation, Casey, is that because we're looking at something over time and over the landscape, that we will get trend information on the species that we're asking about. And so then recognizing that we're going to be collecting, or I guess maybe we should direct them to collect all of the information as identified in question 1 for the baseline, then we can start to ask those follow-up questions with that data that's been collected on, you know, for you know, within the sample where you have active management and you know, that has occurred over the last 5 years, you know, do those amphibian species that you saw in the baseline still exist in those places, right? So having that monitoring data, we will be able to ask those follow-up questions with that. So that's what it is to me. You're getting at persistence by, is it there, is it not there?
So as I understand, you're describing it, so question 2 question 2, we'll just say it's question 2, because really question 2 frames it up as question 2.1. So what you're saying is, it's really simply we're gonna go back and look and see if they're there again.
I mean, that may be much more complex as far as the methodology than that. Comparing different watersheds or like watersheds, or there might be a lot more complexity to that. But to me, that's, you know, ultimately that's what it's trying to get at is over time through monitoring what is happening to these species and recognizing that forest activities happen all over the place. And, you know, these aren't like uncommon activities. We will be able to infer and ask follow-up questions based on that monitoring data.
Well, I just wanted to clarify that there's nothing in question 2 about forest activities. And so I'm just not sure. Are you suggesting that like at some point in the future, and will IRST understand that at some point in the future, are we gonna say something about that?
I think we could include something like that.
I think that's the
other
language Wendy
information.
is talking about, having including.
Should we include that now? Because it's not, you were ready for us to do a temperature check.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I share your question too, Casey, because going into this, question 1 in my mind was baseline, what's going on with the species, and question 2 was a little bit more, how are we gonna understand how forest practices under the rules affect these 2 specific species? And in my mind, we've lost that in 2.
Jason has his hand up as well.
And to then, like, I think we would need to remove the overarching goal language because there's nothing related to the overarching goal in the question.
Maybe Jason's got a proposal.
Jason, save us. Hang on.
Yeah, I wish I had a great answer here, but what I'm thinking though is we're thinking about a subgroup, and I'm just going back to the couple of iterations now that Casey and Seth and I have been through. I still don't think we're there enough for a subgroup to take this and come back. And so what I'm wondering is what we've done in the past is we have had a shorter meeting with the larger group to hash through things that we're stuck on. And I'm wondering if rather than a subgroup here, because I still don't feel like there's a clear direction here, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this is something we do have another interim meeting, but maybe a shorter meeting specifically focus on this to work through it as a group. My fear is if we go back to another subgroup, we're going to be right back here again, and we're going to have to do this twice. So just thoughts.
Yeah. It's not a bad
I
suggestion.
like
I
that
learned so much today.
suggestion. And I guess I would also throw out, maybe we could all take a look at question 1. We'll get that sent out, the updated version. Maybe it's possible we could vote on that and then have a conversation around question 2. That may be too optimistic, but I agree. I don't feel like I have clarity really to direct or offer a work group with direction. That's gonna be a good use of time. And I apologize for
No,
not getting us
you
to a
did,
good
you
place.
did a good job. There's only so much you can do. I mean, the group and everybody's got to have a chance to talk.
You kept moving on.
Just trying to make sure everyone feels their input is considered and we've raised some really good questions. I think question 1 is getting there and we'll get there on question 2. I think we just need to take a step back. And I saw Amanda and then Seth.
I'm trying to understand the perspectives in the room. So we all come from a different place and we all have a specific interest that we're representing. So for those that are not feeling confident with question 2, it sounds to me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, and so help me understand if I'm not getting this right, that simply having a trend of persistence in a positive direction or consistent direction, recognizing that forest activities are happening all over the state at all times, that doesn't lead you to believe that the rules are enough. That they're not protecting the species enough. Because that's, to me, what that second question is getting at. But it sounds like there's an intent or a need to specifically call out specific rules and then develop a study design on that specific rule because there's a concern that it's maybe not enough, or
I'd be happy to take the first part of that question.
yeah, having a hard time understanding your perspective.
Because you said if the populations are increasing and that's good, but if we don't ask further questions now, we won't have anything to answer the question, why are they going down if they go down? So in one set, we're like, oh cool, yay, we're doing really good and we have some protections. If we don't actually put any details on question 2, to me at least, and that's why there were details to begin with, right? Because we all thought that there was important to have details. We aren't going to know what's happening on that landscape to cause them to not persist. And therefore, at the biggest level, right, the federal government is going to be like, actually, you're not doing what you're supposed to do.
That's fair.
Okay. And real to me, it's like, what's happening? And another way to think about it is like a predictive model. So at least to me, I talk to our kids a lot because they're really into like remote sensing. And so like, okay, the predictive model, and we can put this piece and this piece and this piece together and we know our answer, right? Like our answer is the populations are going up or the populations are going down or the populations are staying the same. And all these pieces of it are where we created a model to actually predict that, to answer that question. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, it's along this same vein, so I appreciate it, and I know we're getting close to the hour. I think it is, so to your point, Amanda, forest practices are happening all across the state all the time, right? And so it will be impossible to have a sort of, on private forest land anyway, sites that over time will not have some level of impact, either from something upstream that's changing or something right there adjacent that's happening, right? And so in my mind, when I look at question 2, when it talks about over time, you will implicitly get all of that and more with just by having the time associated. And if we, but to your point, Casey, maybe there is a way, and Wendy, I think your point, to signal that we would like the, additional information captured as you're out there doing the population. What does the adjacent riparian area look like? Where is the proximity of harvest? Where is the road construct? Was it a bridge or a culvert? Those sorts of things, maybe that gets added into that question too, is like, these are some additional variables that to be collected over time as you're monitoring populations, that then you can start to tease out some of those things and see some trends. And then that might lead you to, let's do an actual study, because it looks like based on the data we have that this is impacting that. Let's do an actual focused Baki design study. But in my mind, that question 2 does incorporate some of that just by virtue of it being on private lands, and we're not going to control for activities, and so activities will just always be occurring anyway. But maybe there is a point there where we explicitly call out and ask them to capture some of that data as well. All right. Anyway, I just want to leave that as maybe a parting thought to think about. Maybe in our next hour, we can, when we get back together, we can find a pathway there.
Should we try to find something that's close, relatively close in time for now? Sure.
Yes, no, I think that would be a
Okay.
great use of our last 5 minutes, and I appreciate everyone sticking with this topic. Love to, I also really want to recognize the great work of the work group and thinking through how we as AMC, when we get work group products, can either raise things early enough or be able to move forward with what they have done, because I worry that, these are really complicated topics and they deserve the time and space to consider them, but I also want to recognize and value that work group work. So we're not kind of going back over things, so. Any thoughts or suggestions, recommendations on how to navigate that, I would definitely appreciate. And let's look at our calendars.
It's nice that there's not something like a legislative session going.
My calendar is one way and then I discover it's another way.
So our next AMC meeting is April.
April 7th.
Absolutely, I think we should try.
Yeah.
It's really a lot will happen between now.
Could we try to look at the end of February?
Yeah.
By
The last week, the 24th through.
Yeah, that week's not good for me. Unfortunately, I'm on vacation the last week.
Oh, yeah, we'll be good.
I'll miss the whole thing, but no, I'm free the week of the 17th a lot and the week of the 3rd a lot.
What about the week of the 17th?
That's just long conference.
The 17th, President's Day.
The whole week.
Yeah, President's Day Monday, and then we're tied up with lodging conference Wednesday.
Okay.
Tuesday?
Tuesday it is.
Tuesday.
I mean, yeah, I've got other things that day, but I.
It is
depends what
afternoon.
time.
Tuesday afternoon.
Like 2 to 2 o'clock-ish.
We have a PFA authors meeting at 1 to 2. We could do it right afterwards.
Yeah, I'm not available on Tuesday. You can proceed without me if you want, but
Yeah.
you might have.
Jeez.
responsibilities that,
Well, we could,
Yes, I'm not available.
we can look at March,
First week of March.
keep on the 3rd, the theme of the 3rd.
It's good for me.
Board of Forestry meeting that week, but that's on Wednesday, Thursday.
March good.
There's never any fireworks at those.
My
My lesson is that you stay to the end. It's a good-
So what time on March 3rd?
Yeah, that's good.
I mean, it was,
I'm only available in the morning.
okay.
Morning works for me.
We could do morning.
Before 10.
Jason, oh, there was a.
Before 10?
All that I do.
Yeah, sorry about that. What was the date?
March 3rd.
Before 10.
I've got meetings, but I can move them.
And
I have a meeting next year.
I've got some flexibility that day.
I'm hearing consensus on 9 o'clock on the 3rd.
And how long?
About 16 hours. Condensed into one clock hour.
It's helpful. To your point, Amanda, maybe we can all think about this a little bit, just like your biggest concerns or your roadblocks or the thing that you really wanna see in question 2, and if we can kind of come ready with that more clear, because that definitely became clear to me, the lack of clarity on that in this conversation, just understanding where everyone is on that would be.
And I think with the goal of trying to get there, knowing that we have to start really prioritizing. I know there's additional work that people will really want to get to, but. All right,
All right,
sounds good.
well, we will reconvene on the 3rd, thank you all.
Thank you.
Oh, Terry.
Thank you, Stacey.
What a, stop the recording there, Terry.
Yeah.
We're all done. Yep.